start here shortly. Just give me another minute here, please. While we're waiting to get started, I just want to remind all members of the public that with the meetings like we've done in our past practices, if you want to speak on any item relative to the subject matter of this committee and or any of the agenda items, we're taking all public comments up front on item number 4 in terms of public comment period. So please submit your card if you want to speak again on any item on the agenda. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. The Ad Hoc Financial Stability Committee meeting for May 11th is now called to order. I would like to remind everybody that the meeting is being recorded and being streamed live on YouTube Live. Michelle, can we have the roll call, please?
Member Thomas? Here. Vice Chair Camus?
Here.
And Chair Bruin?
Here.
We have a forum.
Thank you. Okay. So next thing I want to do is the introductions, and once again, we go around the table very quickly in terms of all introductions. And Christine, would you like to start at that end?
Sure.
Oops, I'm sorry, did it? Okay, it's like, I swear all waitresses and waiters have the skill of waiting till you put food in your mouth. Sorry about that.
No worries. Christine Fitzgerald, Chair of VTA, and SDLC staff.
Matthew Quevedo, Silicon Valley Leadership Group.
Glenn Hendricks, I'm the mayor of Sunnyvale. I'm an alternate VTA board member, and I'm a member of the VTA PAC.
Cindy Chavez, member of the board.
Jeannie Bruins, ex officio member of the board and chair of this wonderful committee.
Johnny Camus, San Jose City Council Member, District Number 10.
Ronnie Smith, VTA, ATU 26.
Eighth MDI South Bay Labor Council.
Ray Hashimoto representing VTA CAC.
Steve Jobel, VTA Aspen Chapter President.
Tammy Janetta, NCIU.
Raj Siddiq, the Transportation Architects and Unions Association President.
Okay, welcome everybody. Before we actually start, let me kind of frame a few things for us. This is what, our third meeting? Third meeting. And I think what everyone recognizes is that with these meetings up to this point, it's been a lot of information being given to us. It's kind of more one direction, and we've just trying to absorb a lot of this information. So let's talk about what's going to happen today, and then what's going to happen relative to our next meeting. So today is going to be another day of a lot of information being brought to us. What we're going to see today is information from a consultant. So we're going to see some, an outside perspective on things. And we got a couple of other things. We're going to learn about what the body, the equivalent body did previously, the kinds of recommendations they came up with. When we get to the item that says roundtable, roundtable is again another opportunity today for us to react to clarifying and understanding of the information that we're given. that really is going to now truly set the table for what our next meeting will be about. And so my commitment to you is between this meeting ending today and our next meeting, I'm going to be working with the consulting team, with members of the staff, and we're going to start architecting what our process is going to be for us to pull together and end up, at the end of this entire process, with a set of recommendations. What I'm going to be looking for as the chair, in terms of input, is, again, we've got a lot of the professionals' input and things for us to be thinking about, okay? Then we're going to give all of us a chance, probably, no promises yet, because I haven't architected this yet, but maybe through breakout sessions, where we're going to have an opportunity to also brainstorm and add our own thoughts from the perspectives that you guys all have. We'll probably look at all of those, share all of those, and we're going to take those, plus the recommendations or the ideas that we've been presented with through these presentations, to try and ultimately come up with a set of recommendations for the board. Whether that's going to take us 1 meeting, 2 meetings, 3 more meetings, it'll all depend on our interaction. But again, the next meeting is promised, is where we're going to be rolling up our sleeves and working on this together. Does that make sense?
So can I ask just
Yes.
a tiny question? So my initial understanding was that we had a hard stop at least for a subset of information. Is that not accurate?
Or,
Well, so June 8th, it has here, we're reviewing and discussing, this is item 11, but since I'm not sure if this is the appropriate
work
place
plan.
to bring this up, but I'm just trying to understand, Jeannie, what product, if any, do we need to have by X date? And I think the critical component, the reason I'm asking that question is that the way the agenda is laid out for today, I just want to make sure I understand what we're going to be using today for, relative to whatever product you feel like we need to have by X date.
so let's get through the presentation, and then when we start with the roundtable, we'll go through that, because I think it'll make more sense when we hear the presentations and we have our opportunities.
So then I would have a second request.
So the big thing, remember, our chair of the VTA board, Mayor Licardo, he had a goal for us in terms of June. Because this is so complex, and because we spent our meetings really trying to get educated, so all of us have a level playing field, a solid foundation, we're going to be going, I think, beyond. We're not going to be ready to do the presentation of set of recommendations by June, because we have to be able to do our own work ourselves, okay? So we're going to have, I think, at least 1 more meeting is what the expectation is.
Okay.
Correct?
Then
Is
I'm
that
gonna-
accurate, Jim?
All right, then the other thing I would just ask is, as you set up the discussion today, if you could help us understand how long your expectation is for each of these items, because I know we blocked out till 4, but I'm just wanting to understand what our expectations should be in terms of the time of presentations, both so that we can have that rich discussion that you just described, and then second, because I think that's really the main reason. But I think the discussion about next steps is so critical to that I want to make sure I understand how the roundtable will allow us to get through this and then have a discussion and then get to next steps.
Okay, so let me do it right now, kind of shifting gears a little bit, orders of the day. So the first thing I will let you know is that today, our bulk of our time is going to be spent on item number 6, which is hearing from the consulting team, and item number 7, which is reviewing and understanding the set of deliverables that came out of the 2010. So that way we can look at that as a benchmark.
Jeannie, when you
And
say
number
that,
8 is
what's
being,
6 mean?
number,
6, does that mean it's 2 hours, it's an hour?
you know, can the consultant team, I think the presentation is about an hour, and I guess it'll depend on the questions and such, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, it's a hefty presentation. I mean, you have in front of you your slide packet for item 6, so there's a lot of material here. Okay, so 6 is really gonna be a biggest piece of this today. And number 8, is the presentation from Spur is going to be deferred. Okay? So we don't have number 8, and then number 9 on our agenda is, going through very quickly a follow-up of the information that we had requested from the previous meeting. So number 9 should be very, very quick. Okay? And then through number 10, when we get to this round table, again, I will, based on what's happening up to that point, we'll reiterate what we're looking at next. And this is where, again, have any other questions, any comments, anything that you want to say in terms of helping to shape our next meeting where we will do some work. Okay? Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and move on. And you know what, just let me, logistics in here, because this is a very linear kind of configuration and all. I cannot see necessarily everybody's lights, so if you want to speak for something, have questions, try and catch my attention through some physical movement, because I can't see yours at all. Okay, and again, think about this a little bit informal, so it's okay to kind of interrupt if I don't catch. Okay, so with that, again, on item number 3, orders of the day. Again, item number 8, the presentation from Spur will be deferred to our next meeting. Are there any other recommended changes to the order of the day? Seeing none, can we get a motion?
Second.
Okay, I got a motion, and a second. All those in favor? Any opposed? Passes. Okay. Now that moves us to public presentation. And I have 4 speakers today. John Courtney, followed by Roland LeBron, Jim Stallman, and Aaron Moreau. So if you could come up and to the mic.
Good afternoon, and thank you for putting in this work. I know it's a lot. So I'll be short and sweet. My name is John Courtney. I'm the Recording and Financial Secretary for ATU Local 265. Bus mechanics, operators, light rail operators, light rail mechanics, and other jobs within the authority. We run this authority. Okay. So this committee was formed to basically address a $20 to $40 million deficit. That number seems to change almost with every sunrise. And at first, we were blaming low fare box recovery. And I say that losing 8% of your riders when you change to, when you get rid of the day passes has a lot to do with that. And I didn't need a committee to figure that out. And I also think that the underlying theme of this entire committee is to basically blame labor and labor cost. Let's keep in mind, this is a public transportation agency. We're not for profit. No one has ever figured out how to make a profit from public transportation, ever. It's not what we're here for. Lastly, I'd like to say that I kind of question anything that comes out of this committee, particularly after last month's meeting, when it was basically hijacked. The meeting was hijacked with a presentation about emerging technologies, and I get that, but I think even the chair was surprised that we spent an hour and a half listening to a presentation. Do I have the right to make an hour and a half presentation? Is that okay? Can I do that? So I question the integrity of anything that comes out of this committee. Lastly, the #1 goal was to put riders on our system. So if we're going to go driverless as our #1 goal, we're going to have a bus with no driver driving around a bus with no riders. Doesn't make sense to me. Have a great day.
Thank you, John. Roland?
So, Madam Chair, first thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that the comments that you made off camera about whether discussion is about items on the item or not is in direct conflict with the agenda, number 4. The thing I really want to talk about today is conflict with the planning committee that is still ongoing right now in Oakland. Discussions, mobility, hubs for seniors, Los Gatos, preemptive signaling for bicycles, and legislation to reduce parking around bar stations. Hello, you just got sued by the shops. If we can have a bigger than JPAB meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd like to know why we cannot have this meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, give people an opportunity to drive from Oakland, because obviously, public transit is not going to do it. Last thing I'd like to touch on is the electrification of Caltrain to Gilroy, which is in the IT rail business plan. This comes to pass, the geographical center of the line is going to shift from Redwood City to Sunnyvale. Sunnyvale is slap bang in the middle of the line. And I'd like to point out to you is that you have an opportunity at the June board meeting to exercise your option to indicate to Trans that the services are no longer required, and the VTA will take over administration of Caltrain. If you do that right off the bat, you will balance the budget, because you're going to cut off $6 million worth of fat. But what you're also going to discover is now you're going to have a backbone in Santa Clara County that will be the very first line that will be capable of operating at a profit. But once you have that, you can start hanging up the rest of the system around it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
Jim Stallman, I live in Saratoga. Number one, consider the financial impact of the one-year delay of BART startup. Number two, please consider the one-year estimated delay in Measure B funding becoming available. And three, become one of the prize four at MTC, instead of MTC just showering money on the top three. Right now, AC Transit, BART, and Muni get all this extra money when a third of the Bay Area is coming into Silicon Valley, and you're having to spend all this money to provide transportation. So we got the representation we need at MTC. Let's become part of the top four and not be left out of money and have to deal with these meetings and stuff. Because we want transit as number one priority here. We got a good trajectory, recovery trajectory on our transit right now, and we don't want to lose them or lose our transit. Thanks.
Thank you. And our last speaker, Aaron.
Thank you. Good afternoon. In your item 7 packet, item 7 in your packet, where it shows the guiding principles and the recommendation from 2010. On the other side, there's some red delineations of cost savings. The last item with paratransit, why isn't there a cost savings there? Why isn't it broken out? I mean, you went from a broker model to a direct contracting model. I'd like to see the cost savings that VTA has occurred from bringing it back from outreach to MV. Secondly, I asked that the consultant this afternoon go not drudgingly slow, but methodically, because it is a lot of information for the public to absorb. And we still have major problems with the paratransit service here in Santa Clara County. I would like to see some accountability being held now with MV Transportation. I have 57 seconds to tell you in a nutshell that the service is terrible. I would have never, ever have given up the service from outreach to MV Transportation. It's atrocious, and they need to be held accountable. I know staff is continually working hard and diligently, but I've been an active rider for almost 20 years, and I have never, ever experienced some of the issues that I'm experiencing now. The management team is inept, they're incapable, and it is a right under FTA regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Let's, thank you to our speakers, and Raj, in your presentation, will you touch on any?
I can answer that, no, that's okay.
You want to go ahead and answer it now?
Sure. We still have not completed one full fiscal year after transition, so I'm a little bit gun shy about including any numbers, but preliminary, bold-faced, underlined, preliminary numbers indicate there will be a modest savings compared to what we used to pay in the past year. Once we complete a full fiscal year, once we have audited numbers, I'll have a lot more confidence in publishing those numbers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that takes us over to item number 5, which is approve the Ad hoc Financial Stability Committee meeting minutes of April 13th. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. No, if there's no disagreement, we will get passes unanimously. Okay, moving us to item number 6. Again, this is the presentation from our consulting firm, PFM. Welcome, Russ.
Thank you. Thank you, committee, for having me here today. Again, we've rebranded Public Financial Management, or PFM Group Consulting. I'm the director with them, and here out of the San Francisco office, and do primarily focus on municipal governments and municipal agencies, fiscal analysis and forecasting. And so what we have here is a review and analysis of the several items that were requested by the ad hoc committee. So listed here. So I'll just go through these quickly. What did you ask PFM to do? One was to review VTA's budgeted and forecasted revenues and expenses. So we'll talk about that today. Review service delivery and business models and financial structure and other similarly positioned transit agencies. So we have done some outreach. It's been about a 6-week time frame to get to here, 6 to 7 weeks. And so we haven't, so what we have is what we could find in a number of different agencies we think are similarly situated. Review revenue sources and ability to enhance or identify other funding sources. So we look at VTA's revenue and other type of sources that you might be able to pursue. Look at the cost structure, respond to other ad hoc committee requests, and there's some that we've tried to include in here, like first mile, last mile, mobility responses in other agencies, and then provide recommendations to close the structure deficit. So what we look at today is not the recommendations part, but a lot of options that we think will hopefully lead you to some recommendations. So the presentation will look at the peer agency comparisons and then go down to revenues and expenses, which will have both VTA and peer agency comparisons. Then we'll get into the VTA budget model forecast. We'll then kind of go back how other agencies address their budget deficits, and then come into options to address the structural budget deficit. So with that, let's jump into the overall peer agency comparisons. And we're using for this the National Transit Database, NTD as it's called. So this is a database that is populated by all transit agencies nationally, and it gives the best apples-to-apples comparison for agencies that we're using. So these are national trends. I'll say the latest data is only through 2016 because it takes a while to get that data in after the end of the calendar year or fiscal year. And so we're a little behind, but this is the best apples-to-apples comparison we have. So overall, what we see in transit operations nationally is since between 2006 and 2016, that 10-year period, there was a ongoing increase, the little dip during the recession, and ongoing increases in vehicle revenue hours. So vehicles were out there providing service for more and more hours, and consistent with that is increased operating expenses. So operating expenses continue to increase as well. But on the service side, and this is, we talk about unlinked passenger trips, as we would probably call ridership. So if you take a round trip, you go somewhere and you come back and transit, it's 2 trips. So the unlinked passenger trips or ridership has been flat to declining. Again, nationally, which is something you've experienced here as well. We'll talk about VTA experience on the next slide. At the same time, annual passenger miles traveled has been trending up, a little dip in 2015,
2015. So those, these numbers are, what do they mean? To me, it means that you're, again, transit, while there's more hours being provided, people are taking fewer trips on transit. And what are the reasons for that? I think it's one that's kind of hard to determine, but there are a lot of different, possibilities for why this happening for the economy, other options that are available for trips and whatnot. Trip trends for VTA. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
When we're looking at these national trends, is this all transit agencies, independent of
Yeah,
whether it's heavy rail, light rail, bus?
Yeah, these are all transit agencies, so this is across the board. Yeah. So we'll get down into the individual agencies, when we go to revenues and expenses. We'll just be, and we'll separate that by bus and light rail, as well. So just looking at VTA, you have this, similar to national trends. I think you've dipped a little longer, you've been flat. You started some decrease in ridership on the left in 2016 with a bigger dip in 2017. So we do have information for 2017 for you, so we've added that in here. And this shows light rail at the bottom, transit in the blue, and then total trips, including a shuttle, at the top. At the same time, your average trip length has been, again, increasing, so people taking longer trips. It decreased in 2017. I can't tell you why that is, but that's the information that we have on there. So you're similar to the national average, and maybe, so it's, you're good, I guess you have company, but not in the way you'd like to have company. So your transit trips have been trending down. So when we go into the revenues and expenses and we start looking at how do you compare with other transit agencies, we picked 6 peer agencies that kind of based on some proximity, based on similar size of population served, based on some requests by ad hoc committee members that we'd like to include. And we've drilled down to these specifically for comparisons. The outliers probably are, again, and you're kind of right in the middle. LA, MTA is obviously much bigger, but has very similar types of service. And CTA is further away, but that was one of the agencies we were asked to include. So that's the comparison agency. So we look at comparisons. These are the 7, including VTA, that we're comparing. So now we're going to get into the revenues. Let's just start with what are VTA revenue, what's the transit revenue profile? I think as most of you know, you've seen the presentation, is that the majority of revenue coming into the VTA is sales tax based. So whether it's direct sales tax or a portion of sales tax collected at other places that get allocated to transit, 83% of the revenue you have is sales tax based. And what we know about sales tax based revenues, they're very, they're very sensitive to economic conditions and changes. And we'll show something about that in a few more slides. And any increases to sales tax base or any increases to any tax-based revenues for VTA in California requires a 2/3 vote of the people of the areas being taxed. So the voters get to vote, has to be a 2/3 level, again, which you know. So that's a limitation of increasing that. And your fares are and this is the 18 budget, they're a little over 8%, fare box revenues. So comparison to other areas, and just kind of talk about this kind of globally, the box on the left is sources of revenue. And there's as you might imagine, different agencies have kind of different sources, but we can see that kind of local funds, sales tax and other funding, especially in California, but local funds are the primary source of revenue for most agencies. The Utah agency gets state revenue, and then TriMet, which is in Portland, has that kind of the local agency funding. That tan box at the top is income tax, which they instituted several years ago. But in California, the state reserves the right for income tax, so no local agency or local government can charge an income tax in California. So it's actually not an option here, but it's been a very stable source of revenue in TriMet. And then on, again, kind of the directly generated sources of revenue, there's a little variation, but you're in the same spot. Oh, somebody have a question? Yes. Oh, hey. Oh.
Do you have the sources of the local funding broken out somewhere?
Yeah, well, yeah, we talked about that a little more, coming up in terms of some of those sources. Well, no, we don't. Well, we can get them to you. I don't have it broken out here.
We do have it,
Yeah, we have it. I just don't have it right here to show you right now. We can get that to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So revenue comparisons. So now just looking at revenue comparisons, one thing that is common among all agencies is a drive for fare box revenues. And so what we show, what you see here on the graph to the right is that that everybody's had declining fare box revenues, which kind of goes along with declining passenger trips or ridership. VTA, in every year we looked, and we looked at FY13 through FY16 was the lowest of any agency. The matrix on the left shows the percent breakdown for these. And you see, I think, in more denser populated areas and denser, just more concentration of people who can take transit has higher fare box revenues. LA actually is doing pretty well as well. And we show, because we have the data for FY17, VTAs continue to go down through FY17. So it's been a consistent reduction and continued FY17. Do not have the information for other agencies. And then, when we talk about fare box recovery, it's combined of two different pieces of information. One is your fare box revenues, and the second is your transit expenses. So your fare box recovery is going down not just because ridership and fare revenues are going down, but it's also going down because expenses are increasing for different reasons. So that's the balance that you have to look at. You're talking about fare box recovery ratio and having fares hope to make up some of that difference of where you're having issues. All right, so on the expense side, expenses are a little more complicated than revenues, where it's primarily one source. But what you have here is that you're dominated primarily by income or labor-related costs. So wages and benefits make up more than 50% of your costs, and non-labor, which would be contracts, fuel, everything, all the stuff, materials and supplies and all of that. It shows up as the next big piece of the pie. And on the benefit side, that's primarily made up of health premium benefits and pensions are the two parts that make up most of your benefits, and then there are several other benefits that make up the rest. So compared to we're now looking at some cost efficiency measures that kind of look at the expenses on different levels in the comparison groups, for VTA and the comparison groups. So this one is unlinked passenger trip again. So what's the cost per rider taking a bus or light rail vehicle somewhere? And these are broken down by bus and light rail. So bus on the left, VTA is the highest among comparison groups at $7.54 per passenger. And it goes down to as low as, for the Chicago Transit Authority, at $3.09. So quite a range in cost per passenger. And of course, this is a function of your total cost and the total number of passengers that you have. And as you saw, CTA, which there is an inverse relationship here between high fare box recovery and some, I think, lower cost per passenger. Cost per passenger on light rail, VTA is also the highest by far of anyone else. And again, it would be a function of cost versus the number of passengers on that system. And then when we look at this in terms of cost per service hour, so this is the service hour is the number of hours you're providing service for the different types of bus and light rail. And what we see here is actually on the bus side, when you just look at the hours of service out there, there's much less differentiation. So that means, because this does not include any passengers in it. This is just the service you're providing, the number of hours you're providing, divided into the cost. And so VTA, while you're among the highest, you're less than Sacramento Regional Transit. You are, you're the second to the highest. Is there?
Yeah, I was. What I didn't see is, cost of living for comparison for those areas. Did you also do a study about that as well?
Yeah, we didn't include cost of living, but we could, that's something we could look at.
Madam Chair, if I may, there was a question about local source of revenues. I can respond to that. There are two local sources of revenue, 1976 sales tax, that's about 47% of the overall revenue. The second one is 2000 Measure A, that's a little over 9.5%. So combined, you get about 57, 58% of revenues are from local sources.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Mr. Smith. So we did not include that here, but it's something we could include and provide to the committee. So there are definitely differences in cost of living and in these different areas.
Well, yeah, because I understand that the cost of living may be a reason why the wages and benefit packages definitely are, there's a difference between the other areas. So Chicago, which is a highly goods area, LA, higher goods area, the cost of living is quite substantially different and lower than, the Silicon Valley here. So I think just to be fair,
Right.
fair, so we should look at all comparable numbers.
And let me say is that as we look at this and we go through this, what we're trying to do is, really address the issue you have before you. And there are factors, there's lots of factors that will influence what you actually pay and the service you actually provide, that we're not trying to comment on here per se, but we're just trying to say, this is the issue you have. Here's how it compares. Here's some options for dealing with that, but it doesn't fill all, there's lots of factors that go into this, in terms of decisions the board has made over the years.
Yeah, so I wanted to try and understand between, on the prior slide, you had the UPT, and then we get to this slide, and we break out by different sections. Is there a reason that the UPT doesn't have a breakdown of what makes up that component? So it says VTA is the highest.
Right.
But then it's hard for me to see what are the pieces that go in. It's a little bit to the question that's just being asked. It might be nice to understand what are those factors that are there. Because when I saw that slide, what I have written here is lot. And
Yeah, right.
On your other, if I can just finish, we're saying VTA is the most, and we're kind of implying that's bad. And a little bit to the question you just asked, maybe there might be mitigating factors in there to explain why that is. But I think it would be interesting to see. I would like to be able to understand a little bit better, the difference between 3.9 cents and 7.54. What are those factors that go in, and do those bars, if they're similar, that's interesting. If they're not, if they're dissimilar, that's interesting, because you break it out on the other ones. So that's where it might be nice in future reports to be able to see what are those breakouts, because I think that's what, to get to kind of this question that's being asked about cost of living and stuff, we need to understand the relative size of those underlying bars that make up those pieces to help us get to some of the why of what goes on, and is it good or bad or whatever it might mean.
Madam Chair, if I may, and I totally agree, and we should break it down. The reason we selected these transit agencies was a recommendation of members, but I think it's important to then highlight what some of those very same factors are, so that we don't talk in generalities about you need to compare us against New York, when in fact it's not an equal
And I don't
apples to
have a
apples
problem with the
comparison.
choices, it's just whatever we pick, we're gonna have to get into some of those differentials.
Yeah.
If I may, two slides, I think the next slide, slide 18, does break it down.
This breaks down as percentages, but not as individual costs. And that's another point I would take out. It'd be helpful to understand these things as percentages and costs on the same charts. I'm not a statistician, but I can use statistics to do whatever else I want. So just because a percentage is high, it might be, but relative to the actual numbers, because I saw percentages of who were compared to other agencies, but not the size of what their budgets are, the number of services hours they're providing, number of hours of service, all those kind of things. So we need to make sure there's a common groundwork to how we're looking at this.
And I think what you point out is the difficulty of looking at comparisons, because there is difficult to get exactly apples to apples, because you have different geographic and different service conditions, you know, so yeah, so we are trying to provide stuff that'll just give you a sense, right? And I'll say with this one right here, the cost efficiency measure comparison, which does break the cost down by type of cost, is that while, you know, VTA on cost per hour for light rail, you're in the middle. Now that's higher at 707 in 2017, there is 2016, but you're kind of in the middle, right? So which, you know, and then that's on the bottom slide for VTA and light rail, and you're a little higher on bus, but everybody, there's more of an equality. And I would say in terms of the ratio of where you're spending your money, those ratios are fairly similar, right? So it's not your like overspending per se relative to the entire, you know, cost, but you have a higher cost basis on which you're spreading things. So that's kind of the point of this. It's not to say good or bad or anything else. It's just to say, you know, I think your cost per passenger is high because you have fewer passengers, partly, for your system. And where you're spending your money, you know, is not out of step with what you see in other agencies.
But again, what might be interesting to see is what is my relative cost per service hour, regardless of how many passengers are on it.
Right.
And do those ratios come out the same? And to your comment about trying to find apples to apples, I understand these are very, you know, you can't get them exactly that way. That's why it might be nice to see some of those other factors so we can understand the differences that are there, so that we're not assuming that things are apples to apples.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Fair point. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question. We'll get a couple more questions for you, Tammy.
I think that when you talk about the numbers and the comparisons, like, we all know all these numbers have changed based on who you picked on the initial list. Like, why are there not more regional agencies like San Francisco and San Mateo? And when you look at the population, it's completely different. Everybody's under 3 million, and then all of a sudden there's LA with 8 million. So we could have picked more people that were down on the bottom and had less population. So I think that's where statistics comes in. And then when you look at your pie chart of the expenses, I want to know when, just like we did this in 2010, when do we get to see the line by line of all these expenses? We need to use that and compare that. If we don't have the information, then we can't do it. So I would like to ask, why can't we have that from 2012 to today? And again, it depends who we use to compare us to when we want to get the number.
Again, Madam Chair, if I may, the transit agencies that we compared against are the transit agencies that we were asked by this committee to compare against. So let's just establish that. We'll be happy now to then go back and identify the factors. Thank you.
I just also want to point out, we did not look at lots of different, I mean, with that, we didn't look at lots of different factors and cherry pick, right? We had agencies and we looked at those agencies. So not that there's different agencies will give you different comparisons. Yeah.
Excuse me, Ms. Fernandez, I'm wondering, are you saying that you don't know how you stack up against the regional agencies? Are you saying you don't have those numbers?
I didn't say that. Just trying to make a clarification, because it's come up a couple times this afternoon, where we were asked, why are we comparing against agencies that are in, I think there are too many mics on, why we're comparing against agencies that are not in the same ballpark as ours, as we are. And I just wanted to remind the committee that 2 meetings ago, we were asked, when it was around the table, to do comparisons, not just talk about us, but show how we compared, and we were giving specific agencies. So we've come back now reporting on that. We've heard that we've been asked to disaggregate that, and we will. Thank you.
I totally appreciate that, but I'm also wondering, so can you also include the regional agencies, how we stack up with the cost comparisons are?
If you all provide us
So I'm
with
gonna-
of every agency wants to include.
Let me jump in here for a moment. So, I do want to get through the presentation, I think it's important, but what I'm going to ask you is make notes, okay? Everyone take good notes, to keep us all on it. But, for example, on the agency, when we get to the roundtable discussion, let's see if we can all agree on what those agencies are, because, remember last time I referred to it as a shopping list? So let's be very specific about what's on the shopping list. And again, I believe what Nuria is talking about, with everybody with first names today, okay? What Nuria is talking about is she was reacting to what we heard, but what I did not, as a chair, I take responsibility, did not go in and have us validate, is this the list we're talking about, so that we could have done it at that point in time. So I will take responsibility for not having managed that part of it effectively. So that's what I'm asking you today. Take note. So, I hear Muni, I hear Samtrans on here. Anybody have anybody else? Let's get at the roundtable discussion. Let's come back to this item. Is that fair? Okay, with that, I have Cindy Chavez and then Glenn.
And so we've, I think we talked about the
Cindy's first.
Yes.
Sorry.
So just to, I want to better understand an internal way that we do tracking of resources, and I was intrigued with the amount of money we're spending on vehicle maintenance, and what I was thinking a little bit about is a recommendation or some thought that we talked about at the last meeting in terms of how we take money that we're using from campaigns that are capital investments and transfer that over into our usage. And so it appears to me that in some instances we've made some decisions like other agencies around deferred maintenance. So we're not purchasing out of a Measure A or Measure B pot a particular train set. We're instead revamping those trains. So if I were to look at the maintenance cost in particular, like vehicle maintenance here, if we had a capital investment that came out of another pot of money that wasn't our general blessing, would that also be reflected in this chart?
One of the things, I'll be touching on this when we get to the next item on 7. Some of the key principles of the recommendations that came out of the 2010 Financial Stability Committee was to limit the use of capital dollars for operating expenses. That was just the opposite of the direction that was given was, for example, FTA grant, FTA capital grant.
Raj, I know you're going to give a presentation on that.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering for the purposes of what we're looking for on this slide is if we were buying a train set, would that be reflected in the cost?
No.
Okay, and the only reason I'm pointing that out is that as we look at and this goes to your point, as we look at these budgets for maintenance, I know that we've been investing in a good way, a lot of money in maintenance, so we're not having to buy new train sets necessarily, or we're unable to. And I know, because I went and looked at the light rail train set folks who were working on all that good work. So anyway, I just want to clarify that for everyone, because I thought that was an interesting to see the amount of money spent on maintenance and from my perspective, the amount of time and resources we've had to spend on occasion on rebuilding equipment is just really what I wanted to acknowledge might be reflected in here, if that's what I hear you saying.
And if I may just add to that, by law, we are required to meet standards with our light rail and our bus. And the useful life of a bus is 12 years, so we do have a midlife rehab to get to that 12 years. Trains are 30 years. And the exercise that we went through this past year and a quarter really had to do with the amount of miles that trigger when we're supposed to perform that overhaul. So it's a requirement.
But we made some choices. I mean, because the choice could always be, does it make sense to invest more in maintenance to lengthen the life of some of these? I mean, what I recall is that we had an hour presentation around the investments we were making in maintenance, and that the reason we made those investments was to make sure that these train sets could make it to their end of their useful life, that they were safe. I totally remember all those triggers. But it appears to me that we have spent more money on maintenance, in part because we're trying to do something that we think is also protective of the agency relative to capital investments, number one. And number two, and I'll just remind my colleagues about this, that the one time I've seen VTA open a contract, mid-contract, that VTA offered to open was because we were short on the mechanics and we weren't able to pay them enough money to attract mechanics to help work for VTA. And I think that's still a shortage that we have. And so one other thing I would be interested in, better understanding, I'm not, I mean, I just think we have to think about that the cost of living, which goes back to the question that Ronnie raised, pushes us in an interesting way to respond to the regional market in ways that other places may not have to respond to the regional market, including our investment in the people who do that work around mechanics, because there's so few of them. So anyway, just more of an observation.
Okay, Mr. Hendricks.
So just, what I think I heard you say was, just because the bigger maintenance box, thing is bigger doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, relative to others. That's what
Yeah,
I, so
well,
that's,
also, I just want people to understand why.
right,
Why we
but,
need it.
but I had, my real question was, so we've got 610 as the light rail, cost per hour in 16, and it says in 17 it goes to 707. I did my math right, that's 14%. Maybe separate from this discussion, I'd be very interested to understand what is the driver factors that's caused our per unit cost to go up 14% a year.
Oh, we have that.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if you could say that to a separate thing.
Okay.
Is that a short answer?
I'm told it's a short answer.
It's the overhaul, that's right.
Yeah. Overall, one other thing, also the number of service hours, which is the denominator, was a little bit smaller, so that in cost per hour increase.
And I'll say that's,
Just one comment, I'm sorry. I heard something about extending the useful life. With the midlife overhaul, that's not what we're doing. We're just trying to maintain the useful life. That's why it's an operating expense, it is not a capital expense. So, yeah, thank you.
so I think all this discussion to me points out, both the difficulty of using comparisons to determine your direction, right? So they're really to say, how are we doing relative to others, and then ask the questions, why there's the difference, and what goes into here for everything. You build different business models, so I think these are great questions, and they point out both the usefulness and difficulty in using comparisons for more than they should be used for. Okay.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on then.
Yeah, so let's go to budget, model and forecast. So the VTA staff had done a budget forecast. That budget forecast over a 5-year period had the result of leaving in 2022 with a $26 million deficit. What we were asked to do is come in to review the underlying assumptions of that forecast and to extend it to 10 years, which is what we did. Overall, we found the forecast to be have reasonable assumptions. We did change a few assumptions that we thought should be different. Primarily looking at PERS costs and some inflationary costs. We didn't change a whole lot. We thought they were reasonable, but we did put our own view into it. So this is our baseline forecast, assuming that there's no corrective action taken by VTA board. What direction are you headed? And that direction you're headed, we think, is a continuation of what you're seeing over the next 5 years, down to the next 10 years. And let me explain this graph. What this shows is your net operating revenue, so your expenses minus expected expenses minus expected revenues. And again, this is a forecast, it's not a prediction. It's trying to take a look at all the factors. There's a lot of assumptions in here. Let's say, what direction are you headed? Do you need to make a change? So this is just the net revenue, expenses minus revenues. What we show in that box is that you're starting in FY18 with $81.2 million in fund balance reserves. And then if you continue going this way, you don't do anything, which is not a rational ability to do that, but if you did, you would end up in 2018 with a cumulative in reserve. Or FY28, not 18, thank you, $267 million, right? So it says is you have, that's a $267 million kind of nut to crack, and that's the problem. Yes?
Okay, so hang on, so let's just take a pause here. So I want to know if we all understand what went into this chart and how this chart is, because the next set of charts that Russ is going to go through all is rooted on us understanding this chart. Okay, so does anybody have any questions here?
I want to just ask a broad question. When we looked at this chart, and this was a concern I had just even as we look at the at funds that we're trying to get from other sources, including the for example, the transit tax, the gas tax that's gonna be considered. This was taking out anything on the horizon that isn't a yes today. Is that accurate?
It does not include SB1 revenues, which is the gas tax revenues.
Right.
Right.
But, and what's that? Yeah, my assumption would be that that's RM3, that's anything on the table. So then my question would be, and I don't think this is a bad thing to give worst case scenario, because we have to be thinking about that. But what I'm wondering is, what's in between the worst case and the best case? And is that a chart that got developed, or I'm assuming we have an internal.
So as we go, I'll say as we go through, there's different things you do. That's what the next charts are providing.
Okay,
Yeah.
So,
thanks.
So does this have measure B in it?
Yes, it does.
So this has
Yes,
the 2016 measure B.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this is what we know now, that's right. So, so as we go through, we do add some of these other things in and ask for that. So, I just want to point out, so the 260, this is a deficit of 267 million. And then cumulatively for reserves. And then what it doesn't include, also you have separately from your operating budget, you have a capital budget with $30 million a year that you should be putting in that you're not. And that expands the potential deficit to 597 million over the next 10 years. So the other thing that we look at when we talk about this as well.
Wait a minute. Again, because this is a foundation piece for the rest of it, you got a little bit more noodling that's happened over here. So another question.
I want to make sure when we talk about SB1 and RM3 dollars and stuff, and I understand they can be used for both capital and operational things. But if we're a structural deficit, if my glass is partially empty to get to where I'm supposed to be, and I use SB1 or RM3 operational dollars to cover that, that's fine. I legally can probably do that. But that means I'm not increasing my service of what goes on, which is really the intent of some of those things. So I think when we talk about this, it's just to be clear, if we want to talk about the possibility of being able to use SB1 or RM3 dollars to help our structural deficit problem, that's fine. But that doesn't improve or expand the service of what we're talking about. That's taking care of the structural problem we have. Raj, that's great.
Best of my knowledge, there are no operating dollars from RM3.
Okay.
SB1, yes.
Okay, so same comment, but, just SB1.
So
I just want to make the difference of, we could say here we're going to use SB1 to maybe help with some of our structural deficit problems, but that doesn't mean we're expanding the service of what it is, which might be the general thought people think is happening with it, but that's it.
So just if I could, this came out of a little bit of us kicking each other. And I think that, yeah, nicely, but I think that therein lies a much bigger discussion. And I am not prepared to say that what you're saying is 100% accurate, in part because there are so many different moving parts to what gets us going in the wrong direction, A, and B, I think one of the realities, and this is, I'm sure, in a chart, you'll tell me it's in a chart coming up, but one of the other reasons we were looking at other agencies was to better understand their funding infrastructure, and it's part of the reason that we're having a discussion even at Caltrain about their, about their investment strategies, because one of the challenges is we could argue that we have a structural deficit for any number of reasons, including that the mechanism for funding is so unpredictable. So I think that this bigger discussion is a discussion that we'll probably have at the next meeting, because some of the choices will be impacted based on, how we define the roots of that structural deficit, whether or not there is a structural deficit that is, or how people define that. So anyway, I just want to say, I don't want to leave it on the table that that's a defined known quantity, but I'm not sure it is yet. Or yeah.
So I get where you're at. All I was trying to get is to say here, it's somewhere between 0 and 100%. And you can argue about where it is in the middle, but it's not a full thing.
Except, let me just make one more point, and that is that had SB1 passed a year ago, and we've been the reality is that we may be talking about not having a structural deficit, but nonetheless wanting to have a discussion about how we improve our financial structure. So yes, what you're saying is accurate based on point in time. Today, we do this meeting a year from now, SB 1 passes, we're having a different discussion. And that's why I just want to be mindful that we don't have a definition of what it is until we decide what we
Okay,
want to be.
so let me recenter this. So again, when we look at this chart, this has what are it's our current information. We've adjusted it for newer information on PERS, okay? It does not include the operational eligible dollars from SB 1. RM3 has no operational dollars in there, so that one doesn't make any difference. And it does include the operational dollars from Measure B in this forecast.
Correct.
Correct, okay? There's no capital dollars in this. This is all operational only. Okay, that's the baseline that we're talking about,
And
right?
so when you see these, and when you see this, the bars are deficit, or when we get to later, we show how you can combine a lot of changes to get to a positive, that's a surplus. And then we have in these boxes, and I'll refer back to this, and ending reserves under this baseline assumption, these baseline assumptions of negative 267 million. So that's kind of the baseline.
Excuse me, Russ, I'm wondering, can you please explain fiscal year 2021? How is it that you have a structural deficit that continues to grow, and then you have a dip?
That's a great question. The dip is the light rail rehab, which is currently ongoing, is gonna end in 2021, so there's a $12 million reduction in cost. That might be replaced by something else, but we don't have that yet.
Are you saying that there's a $12 million annual cost to the overhaul for light rail?
Correct. Yeah, the total, it's being phased in over a number of years, and it shows up in the budget as $12 million a year.
If I may add a little bit of color to that.
We get a mic in front of you, Raj.
Sorry. I just wanted to qualify the annual cost. Over a period of 3 years, we have had approximately an average of $12 million per year. Once the overhaul is done, which will be 2021, those costs will not be incurred again till the next cycle of overhaul comes up in about 14, 15 years or so.
Okay.
Okay, the next question I have is, what other contributing factors then continue with this growth of the deficit?
Yeah. So the other contributing factors is expected inflation on wages, on pensions, on healthcare, on services and supplies, compared to expected inflation on revenues. So, consistent with what you've seen the last 10 years, is that revenues are growing at a slower pace than expenses. So we base our forecasts on, some history of where you have been, some sense of where the economy is going. And for where we do have numbers like pensions, we put in those pension numbers to the extent we have that forecast from an outside agency. So there are a lot of assumptions built into any forecast. So it's our best guess. I would never say this is exactly what's going to happen, but what we're seeing, these are big enough numbers that you should do something. That would be my policy recommendation. I think that's why you're here, right? You see the forecast, say, it's not going in the right direction. We should do something. And that's, so that's what this provides. All right, so.
Wait, Johnny.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I just didn't want to cut anybody off. So I want to thank Supervisor Chavez for trying to find out what exactly is in this thing. And since we now know that the operational budget includes Measure B operational dollars, we all know that Measure B is being litigated, and we may not have that. So this is not the worst case scenario by any stretch of the imagination. How much, if you factored out Measure B operational dollars, what kind of dollars are we getting operationally from Measure B that we may or may lose?
It's small.
This year, 18, we had budgeted $14 million from 2016 Measure B for operations.
So 18 million, but
14.
14.
14 in fiscal year 18.
So basically you can go to $34 million deficit instead of $20 million deficit, potentially. And then the year after, it could be $40 million in deficit instead of 26.
Potentially, if there are no other offsets, for example, now, if expenses remain the same as budgeted, which we know now they are not because some of the implementation of the network has been deferred because of the changes in the bar implementation opening. So that's one. The second thing, we also now know, at least for this year, unless something changes in December, we have SB1 revenues. So this was when we prepared the budget. Yes, we did include 2016 Measure B. We did not include SB1 because at that point we didn't know whether we were getting it or not. So this is based on that information, and the projection is, just to keep it apples to apples, the projections do not include SB1 but do include 2016 Measure B.
I understand that, but my point is, this is not the worst case scenario.
Oh, yeah.
By any stretch of the imagination.
I agree.
To me, this is like a probably gonna happen scenario.
Yeah.
And I know that, and I really appreciate the fact that you're sitting here trying to make projections, and you know that as soon as you print the projections, something is different. And I think that, right, so I'm hoping that all of us have, keep an open mind and understanding the difficulties that you are dealing with in trying to predict things. And understand that we have to look out for the financial health of our entire system. That being said, the Measure B operational budget was also proposed on the ballot to increase service, not just keep us afloat. And so you have to understand that we shouldn't even count that because the voters were counting on more bus service. In fact, we had a slew of people expecting more money for senior citizens, more money for disabled people, more money and more bus routes. And what we're talking about here is less of everything.
Yes, you know, you're mostly right. Of the $14 million, 12 was for increased bus service.
Yes.
The 2 was to increase services for disabled youth and so on and so forth.
Right.
So with a mix of the 2.
Understand, but it wasn't there to say bail us out. It wasn't. It wasn't on the ballot to bail us out. That's all I'm trying to say. Anyway, I really want to thank you for trying to get us into a mindset of what we're looking at in the future.
That's a good thing on the doom and gloom. SB1 can also be, or may also be repealed, so that would add to the doom and gloom scenario. So, just one point.
Okay, so what I'm gonna ask you guys to do as we move forward this presentation, okay, is understand that the slides from this point going forward have the exact same assumptions that were built into this baseline, okay? So if the baseline's off, that effect carries all the way through, okay, but what we're going to see is how this baseline, so put aside any challenges to whether the baseline is accurate or not accurate right now, because it's gonna be constant as we go through the rest of the presentation. So what you're gonna be able to see now is start focusing in on the order of magnitude.
Okay, and we'll go through, to get there, we'll get through a few changes. One is that because your revenues are so subject to economy, so they relate to the business cycle, right? So we're the second longest expansion ever in the U.S. economy. It's actually forecast to be pretty good going forward the next short term, but just saying that's a consideration you should have. And to that end, we looked at 1976 sales tax revenues received by the VTA back to 1979. And you see the shaded areas are recessions, and you've seen this increasing impact of recessions. To the last 2 recessions having a big impact and negative growth in your sales tax. So I just want to talk briefly, I'll go through this quickly, how have other agencies address budget deficits. And I'm going to talk about these in terms of where they've done this. So they've looked at, the TriMet has done things in labor with defined benefits, retiree health. They've done things in fares by getting rid of free downtown roads, and they've done things in revenues by implementing a new income tax, which we cannot do in California. LA Metro they did something with fares, they did something with labor, And they've also did some business model changes with mobility at their stations, especially in the downtown area. Sac Regional Transit has also done things with labor. They've done things with the new business model, which also includes this kind of microbus, ride-on-demand, accessible service, similar to an Uber pool style. Chicago, again, they've done something with fares, they've done something with their cost basis, they've done something with revenues, and they've done something with labor. So you're noticing that there's a trend here in what people are doing, and it tends to be mixed. King County Metro, again, new service model, doing a lot of different things to tweak service to improve ridership, as well as new revenues and expansion of existing revenues. The other thing we're asked to look at, so you see that very similar kinds of approaches in these different areas is, I think one thing is last mile, first mile. What you see here again is people trying to say, how can we increase ridership by making transit more accessible before you get there or after you get to where the transit ends. And what you see here is a lot of innovative programs, some around partnering with Uber. We did have Phoenix has recently partnered with Lyft to provide better service at those endpoints. There's a pickup on demand of share ride basis within a mile of four major transit hubs in Seattle. Bishop Ransom San Ramon has started a new autonomous electric vehicle shuttles in that neighborhood. They have lots of shuttles going out and bringing people in. You have the LA bike share system, especially big in the downtown, and again, the microbus in Sacramento. So a lot of different innovative programs also trying to increase ridership and be more accessible.
Okay, wait a minute, I think we have one question.
I just want to be able to try and understand, you went through the things these agencies did. What year did they do them in? And when I go back to the previous slide of the UPT,
right,
were these changes done before or after the 2016 piece to know?
Yeah, and we can put that in. A lot of these are, actually most of these are pretty recent things in the last couple of years. I'd say TriMet did some of the stuff that they did in terms of labor costs, they did in the last recession.
Yeah, again, it would just be nice to be able to understand the correlation of those things, are the numbers we saw there before or after these things happened. I'm sure some, the employee-based people right here might not think some of these things are very cool. And, so you just we need to be able to tie and understand the timing and difference of what those things, how they work.
All right. So now when we get to, we've looked at your revenues and expenses, compared those to other agencies, looked at what other agencies have done, looked at what our forecast is for VTA. And so now budget balancing options, and similar to what other agencies have done, and similar to where your major costs and revenues are, we do look at options on the workforce basis, we look at options on services, and we look at options on revenue. So we're going to take a look at each of these individually. And as I go through, these are not recommendations to do any one of these. It's trying to say what's the impact of different options on your budget. So the first one, we'll start with the workforce. Now this is reducing, it's reducing wage and medical benefit inflation. So this is not reducing wages or taking anything away. In the model, the forecast is 3.5% a year, which is actually less than the last 10 years for actual increase in average wage cost or salary cost to VTA. And so we take this down to a lower wage inflation, right? So if we're not going to take anything away from anybody, we just grow it more slowly, which may not be consistent with what's going on in the labor market and cost of living. So this is not doing any of that, but it says if you grow it slowly, because labor is such a big part of the cost structure of the VTA, that doesn't solve your problem, but it can take a big dent out of your problem. So what you see is over time it gets bigger, and so you went from that 267 million ending reserves to here negative 60 million ending reserves. Still a big number, doesn't solve the problem, but it has a big impact on the problem. Yes?
What number were you using?
So we went from 3.5% to 2% a year. So again, that's not a recommendation, but it's saying, it's closer to inflation. What if you were able to stick closer to inflation? Again, this shows relative impact and of what that would be. So that's what the underlying assumption here is. Okay. All right. So, share health insurance costs. You know, again, the VTA has a benefit now that pays for 100% of Kaiser, and this assumes over time you get down to an 80-20 shares as a share, employee share, and VTA share and health insurance costs. And again, this has, health insurance is a big cost driver for the VTA, and this gets not as big as wages, so it gets down from 267 million Indian reserves to 197 negative deficit in Indian reserves. So it could have some impact, doesn't solve the problem, right? So wages didn't solve the problem exactly, health doesn't solve the problem. So we're gonna go through all these, you see the same kinds of things.
What numbers
Yes.
did you select?
This assumes a health, a sharing of 80-20. So 80% paid by VTA, 20% paid by employees.
What numbers did they come out to? Do you remember?
I don't remember, and I could look and see what that is. But if you think of whatever, I'm trying to think family medical coverage, probably about 1,600 right now. For if you're sharing 20-30 over time, you implement that over time. Lots of ways you can do that. It'd probably be about.
You did overtime or a complete 80-20?
Over time, yeah, that would implement over time.
If I can.
Yeah. And I'll say these are just options. These are not recommendations. We're not saying we should do this. Just looking at the impact of some of these different things.
No, I totally get it, but I just think that it'd be helpful if you
Clarify.
how the clarify.
Yeah, I'll clarify underline
How to break down what
So,
actually
yeah,
worked if
yeah.
you did those.
Yeah, so if, going forward, the assumption,
Yep.
the baseline said this, the adjustment
I
was
apologize
that.
for not having that on here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We keep going?
Okay?
Okay.
So, the next one is sharing of pension costs, and this kind of says it in here. It would put everybody on an equal basis of paying 6% of the pension costs. Not all labor groups have that percentage, so it just brings everybody up to 6%. Again, over about a 3-year period of phasing that in. And you go from, that has some impact, not a major, but you go from negative 267 million to here, negative 221 million ending reserves balance. So this is looking at your major drivers of your expense drivers in workforce of wages and benefits, and it goes in order: wages, health benefits, pensions in terms of costs. Okay. All right. So the last one is outsourcing services where feasible. And this assumption, this is, again, this is where feasible. I don't have any. This is a very broad brush assumption. It's looking at if you could contract out about 20% of service costs, and you have a 25% savings, which is kind of the rule of thumb. Generally relates to you have better health with pension benefits in the private sector. So it doesn't necessarily assume a major wage difference, but a major benefit difference in that where the cost savings would come into. And again, you go from 267 million on our baseline to 226 million. So some benefit does not solve the problem at all there either. So those are the workforce. Those are kind of the workforce items.
I was just wondering if you could. I was just wondering if you could get into what that would look like, the outsourcing or
there's
flat service base.
you know what, I'll say in this is just trying to see if you're able to do this. This is a big what if, right? Without getting into the details of what you would outsource or who would you outsource to or who would be impacted, which are all things, if you did outsource, you'd have to get into a very deep analysis of all that. This does not do that. It does, the question of all these is what can solve the issue based on some assumptions of the model we have in place. And so this just makes very broad assumptions. And I think the answer is, it can help, but it doesn't solve your problem.
So if I'm just making sure I understand, you ran a basic model if you outsource a percentage of service. Is that correct?
What's that?
You ran this model based on the assumption that you would outsource a percentage of service.
Yeah, percentage of cost-based service. Yeah. So, and I'll say that as we look
operating costs.
Operating costs. Operating costs. Right. So, and as we look at these, and I do keep saying this doesn't solve the issue, we do think a lot of these things combined do solve the problem, right? So I just want to put that in perspective, that we think there is some solutions, but it's a lot of these things together. Each individual thing, we look at it separately.
But if this is workforce, operational workforce
That's
or
right, operational
outsourcing.
work or outsourcing.
Okay,
that's what
so how much did you move the needle from where we are today? I mean, you know, like before on the health insurance, you kind of said going from, to an 80-20. What, is there?
So this could be, well, this would be all operations. It could be administrative, it could be maintenance, it could be, you know, direct transit services. It doesn't assume, it assumes that 20% is outsourced.
It's
right?
20% outsourced?
20% is outsourced, it's a 25% cost saving. It doesn't mean we'd outsource transit per se, but all operations would be on that list.
If I may, Madam Chair, I think it's very important to clarify that when we talk about outsourcing, it's the operational services. It doesn't necessarily mean bus drivers and light rail operators. We're saying operating services.
Yeah, this is, again, yeah, I think, and thank you, because that's what I wanted to make sure we understand. So when we talk about, all we're doing is, these are hypothetical assumptions that have been made, and again, what we're trying to do is understand, in that hypothetical, like in this one, not targeting any specific jobs or anything like that, but just saying, if we took a 20% across this overall operational workforce, okay, all job types that follow in that, what might you get out of the 20%? And I'm assuming that the 20% is because it's probably a reasonable number. You would not, I mean, saying 100% would be an unreasonable number, so it's trying to say,
Yeah,
let's
just
just
make
go
it
for it.
a reasonable range, but yeah, right, not targeting any individual group or saying any job. And it's with all these workforce, with all these workforce related issues, they're difficult things to implement, right?
Yeah.
So because they affect people.
Correct. Okay.
Jeannie, if I could
Yes.
add, what might be useful with this presentation to show to whoever else next is, I was trying to understand, if you go back, you don't need to go back, but it's slide 21, which is what your base was. And, you know, for example, in fiscal year 2022, that's where you showed we were 27.7 in the hole. It might be nice in these graphs if you showed that original bar next to it. So
Yes.
then I could look at in 2022, where if I was just looking hypothetically at control wage inflation, it's, you're saying you're at 14.7. So then somebody could see what is the impact to our structural, to the budget problem, to see how much each one of these things individually, hypothetically, not that we're saying do that, but because that would just on the same chart let you see, here was your baseline, if you did this hypothetical thing, here's how the bar changed.
Well, I've been saying that each time because I think that is something that's missing from here.
Right,
Yeah,
I think just, it would change,
Yeah.
so in the future, whoever's gonna get this data, if you could change the graphs a little bit, because that's, I think, what you're trying to show. You're not, I think you're not trying to say, here, we should do, you know, wage control or whatever. You just said, if you did this thing, hypothetically, this is what it does to those out-year projection models.
Right.
And how it changes that.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so, a couple that I don't have, you know, charts for because we don't have cost on, but, you know, rationalized fleet sizing is what, are there things that you could do to, smaller vehicles, you know, different kinds of routes that don't demand larger buses, microtransit such as what Sacramento Regional Transit is doing? Are there things you could do that could reduce, maintenance, driver cost, or, capital costs, or anything else? We don't have, savings that, just things you should be doing. I don't think they'd have a huge impact, but the things you should be doing, because they probably will have some impact. Fleet electrification, which the VTA is starting on that now. We believe there's going to be, there should be a savings in fuel and maybe possibly maintenance, depending on how those work. And so those are just ideas without any costs associated with them. And we do want to write service levels. This is another, all of these, anything that really moves the dial in terms of budget is going to be controversial, right? So one is, you have in the budget this expansion of service for Next Network. And the question is, if you didn't do that, or if you did part of that, right? So what's the impact of that? And so the cost in there is, we have $19 million net, so it's $23 million cost plus an assumed $4 million increase in fares. And so what we show here is, that again, the benefit, if you didn't do it, and again, not recommending that, but I think that's something we have to at least look at in terms of additional costs that have been added. And so as you can see, the top budget is assuming no Next Network. If you're able to take out $19 million a year of additional net cost, then you have a negative $54 million ending reserve versus $267 million ending reserve under our baseline. If you did half of that somehow, and that's again not saying how you would do that, but you had a reduced cost of half, that reduces from 267 million to 167 million. So it's just looking at changes in services.
Okay, so again, guys, the baseline had implementation of Next Network as planned.
Yes.
Then these are what if you do no implementation
Or
during these 10 years.
During these 10 years.
And the bottom one is if you implemented an arbitrary number called half.
Right.
Okay?
And anything in between, kind of, this gets you comes as a range.
Gives you a range.
That's right.
Okay?
All right.
Can we continue on?
Yeah. So next is indexing fares. So increasing fares with CPI or some other index. So you may have different fare increases that come along. This is just assuming that you're building in additional fare revenue as you go along versus any kind of big fare increase. We also have some assumption that there's ridership increase in here as well that factors in. But again, you go from 267 million to 196 million. So it has some impact if that's something that you would actually have this impact in reducing the deficits. Now another one we looked at is increased measure 2000 measure A support. And this is actually shifting from capital into operations. And so if you shift it into measure A from capital to operations, again, depending on how much you did with that, that could again reduce the deficit as well because you're taking other revenue. Yes.
Really quickly, is the assumption there just back of the napkin calculations about $20 million a year increase contribution?
Yeah, this would be about, I think this would be about $10 million a year roughly.
$10 million?
Yeah. And then, just what other, if you could do an additional sales tax revenue. Now that's, you have a lot of sales tax revenues. This might be very difficult to get passed, but that is your major source of funding. Is there a possibility of increasing that? And we just looked at, you need 0.1% increase somewhere. I don't know if you can actually put something out that's a 10%, but just wanted to show that you actually come up now. Now, first time we're seeing something above the line, and this is an outside revenue source. It's still sales tax based, but it solves the revenue problem as opposed to focusing on the expense problem. There is an issue if you're up against the limit of what can be charged in sales taxes. It would actually require an exemption at the legislative basis to get that done. So there's a lot of hoops beyond the fact you need 2/3 votes to have this come in to do this, but that's your main option for revenue is something that has to get voted on. So then we look at just two scenarios. So I kept saying not one of these, this doesn't fix it, this doesn't fix it, but when we look at a variety of different things, so different strategies, whether it's slow growth, this includes slow wage growth, increase in transit operating moving from 2000 measure A into operations, indexing fares, contracting out services and savings there. And we also assume that we're able to bring in SB1 operating revenues because there's not a repeal, right? So if all those things you're able to negotiate all these things and these things happen, in the economy, then what you see is this, actually by 2021, you're getting up to a positive net balance. So by the end, you have $92.8 million in Indian reserves. Now, just contrast that against, remember what we said at the beginning, is this doesn't include your capital needs, which during the same time period about $330 million, right? So you would still have to figure out a way to come up with that. So if you combine these things together, this still doesn't solve your capital problem. This just solves your operating problem. And then we just looked at, okay, another scenario, implement a lower cost next network, employee share and healthcare premiums. We don't try to slow wage growth, index fares, and again assume state gas tax revenues. And you get about the same kind of result, actually twice as high here, right? Just depending on what lever you're able to pull, you have a positive $196 million ending balance versus your negative $261 million, and versus the other scenario, $92 million. So this gets you closer to having money to do your capital needs, right? But you're still short on the capital needs, which is about $330 million. So that's looking at both on this forecast, right? The different options that you have, which are really focusing on the major revenue and expense drivers of the VTA, And then, saying that, there's not one silver bullet, but if you do a lot of different things, you have a package of changes, you can cobble together something we think that will get you to a positive budget and a healthy budget. But it's still difficult, still doesn't solve your capital problems or capital funding needs over the next 10 years.
So, Russ, I'm wondering, did you take into account any new innovative revenue producing activities that VTA maybe could do? Maybe land leasing, new technology, or something like that? Any
We didn't have time to dive into some of those specifics. And part of the issue is, say with land leasing, I think, if it's land leasing or, different advertising or, there's a lot of small things people have done that I think there's things that you're doing now that bring in revenues. It's really difficult to get a lot of revenue, although I think those are definitely worthwhile things to do. The issue, you have fair revenues, another we talked about, but at the same time, that most of your revenues are tax-based. Any kind of tax-based revenue requires a 2/3 vote. And you can,
Yep. It's just want to add something to that. We are doing advertising as much as we can. In fact, we have increased advertising revenues over the last 2 years or so. That's one. The second thing, that land leasing or real estate property development, that's something that's been a pretty big focus of ours for the last 2 years. And these are all things that would take a little bit of time. Yes, we're definitely doing that. And we will be getting increased revenues, but nowhere near enough to solve the threshold that we have here.
Okay, any other clarifying questions?
Just have a quick question around that revenue question one more time. I think we just talked about the Measure A potentially increasing revenue for transit operations from that revenue measure. I think right now we're about, is it 20 and a half, or is it 21% or so from that?
20.75.
This would increase it to about what percentage?
Right.
That's the question.
To what percentage?
I mean, we can do that. That would be more of an academic, exercise, because from a practical standpoint, there's nothing left in Measure A for operations at this point. Okay, 20.7, 2000 Measure A, 20.75 was the maximum we could take without taking anything from the existing projects or the planned projects.
Thank you. And then my next question would be, are there any other taxes that do require a 2/3 vote that have been passed regionally?
I don't know about having been passed, but other taxes that we could do. Yeah, have been taxed, well, taxes that get, there's parcel taxes, which is a dollar amount on parcels. That again require, everything for transit is gonna require 2/3 vote, because we're using it for transportation authority. There's Melrose Community Facilities Districts that, require, I know that the VTA staff has looked at targeted CFD, Melrose Community Facilities Districts, or assessment districts, especially around transportation, TODs, right?
Like tips or.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, that's right. That's right. And so those are things you could do. They provide, if they're targeted, they provide some money, not a whole lot. Oftentimes, things like assessment districts have to be used for capital and not operations. Belarus can be used for operations. The parcel tax, which is very broad-based, can be used for operations.
I guess also just in general, a question. Are we maximizing our excise taxes at all? Are there any potential revenue from excise taxes? It's user taxes like a car license fee, some kind of road pricing and that sort of thing.
You get $20 on the vehicle registration fee.
I don't think you have any control over what those are. You do get some revenues from them. I don't think you
You
can
get $20.
Yeah, right.
And it's 1.6 million vehicles registered, so that's what we get. It goes to the cities, it goes to.
Any other clarifying questions? Christine?
No, I'm fine, correct. Again, maybe not a clarifying question, but more of a statement as we're looking at, possibly either, maintaining and or changing out, vehicles, et cetera, that we keep in mind that, anything we do to one, system, we have to do to another. And the paratransit, vans, don't last as long as the buses, and the hardware and the software that go along with that are equally important to maintain and or improve upon. And that'll take a line item that, I'd like to see added in there.
Okay. Rodney?
Yeah, I just want to revisit slide 38, if we could, about sizing service levels. I was looking at the comments and the downsides, and I just want to sit on this for a second and see if you have any additional context that this would keep VTA in a downward transit ridership trend, abandons an effort, and this is under not doing next network, or partially doing next network. And then the fourth point, that survival of transit likely depended on more service, not less. I wonder if in your research there's more that you could say about that, and also if half the program is implemented, do we have a sense of what half?
No. And I'll say these downsides, this is some of what I've heard and some of, from, I think, the board, but I think that the difficulty with services, what you've seen in a lot of the different comparative agencies, right, is different changes in the business model. I think part of what Nextwork is trying to change the business model and trying to change the service levels to make it more accessible, to actually increase ridership. And unfortunately, the offset of the cost of doing that versus what you're going to get in fares, it doesn't offset, right? So you have this increased cost without commensurate increased revenue. So this is not, again, I'm not saying what you should or shouldn't do, but I'm saying that what I understand Next Network to be, from what I've heard the presentations, is something that's going to increase ridership, right? And you probably have to do something, I'll say long term, what's going to happen with transit to make it, viable is that you're responding to the needs of the community and changing your service to make sure it's changing with community needs and community expectations. And so I'm just trying to say, what I'm trying to say with that is, cutting service I don't think is the answer. But you have to look at what you can do within the context of your total expenses and total revenues and where you're spending it. So probably something you have to at least think about, right?
Jeannie, I would just add, you might, again, if this presentation or discussion goes on, we might be better off talking about service hours instead of next-gen changes. Because that's really what we're doing. Next-gen is, if I remember correctly, is roughly same service hours of what it is, but we're redistributing how those service hours are used. So it's not, I think that might be a better context as we talk about this, as opposed to this particular program of what we label something. Because I think that's really what you're trying to get to, is service hours versus how we distribute that versus, frequent ridership lines versus others and stuff. So.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just want to piggyback off of what Ratna and Glenn said about the half service and maybe the impact on ridership. And Raj, or the general manager, would you say the current level of service with the boosted light rail frequency and the boosted service on the two main trunk lines on Stevens Creek and the Alameda are roughly half of the Next Network implementation?
Well, the light rail, being that T is part of it, but I don't know what percentage-wise. I don't see anyone from, here's Jim. He is the author of the.
You have to speak into the microphone.
Yeah.
We're all being told that.
Yeah.
So from what I understand, the Next Network total boost in number of hours costs about $23 million. 12 million of that is light rail, 12 million of that were bus hours, 11 million of that were light rail hours. Is that about half?
Right. Jim will kick me under the table if I misspeak now. on the next network has been doing this for about 3 years at least. Anyway, on the number of hours, that's the only thing I'll speak to, then Jim can speak to any other thing. Light rail service hours were approximately 150,000 service hours per year, give or take a little bit. With Next Network, that's predominantly what we call at VTA the long T, direct line from Alum Rock to Mountain View. With that and a few other changes, when fully implemented, would go to 176,000 service hours. And on the bus side, with the full implementation of Next Network, the service hours would be 1.6 million, as opposed to about 1.45 million at the present time. I'm rounding some of the numbers.
I didn't need to kick them.
May I just make one other point, Madam Chair?
Yes.
One of the things, it's not just the service hours that's the issue. I mean, service hour, if you look at a curve, the cost curve, you have to look at the slope of the curve. That's what is making the structural imbalance. The slope, or the rate at which revenues have increased or increasing, is much smaller. It's at about 2%. The slope of the curve is much steeper for cost. It's about 4%. By lowering service level, all you're doing is what is called in statistics intercept shift. You're bringing the base down, but you're not changing the slope. So in about 4 or 5 years, it'll go back to where it was. Same thing with the infusion of a one-time revenue. Unless you increase the rate of revenue, it's not going to make a difference. Yes, for the 2, 3, 4 years, it may make a difference. In fact, that's a very nice segue into my next presentation, because some of the principles that were introduced or that were directed by the then 2010 Financial Stability Committee, many of which we implemented, but we are back at the same, for the precise reason I just explained. It's the slope of the two curves that have to meet. Hopefully the revenue curve will be steeper than the expense curve.
Because we're not structurally, if you don't structurally change things, you don't address the structural deficit.
That is correct.
Yes, I think that's probably the biggest thing. So, okay, so what we're gonna do in terms of time here, are there any other questions that we have for Russ relative to the presentation? And you'll get another bite at the apple when we get to the round table part of the agenda. Okay, but anything right now, any other clarifying questions? So if not, what we're gonna do now is go ahead and move on. Russ, thank you so much, and we know you're not going very far here. Now we're gonna move to item number 7. And this is a review of the 2010 ad hoc financial recovery recommendation. What was done, and I think what Raj is going to help us also understand, we hopefully get to learn from what happened in 2010, and what of the recommendations really were more equating to kick the can down the road, okay, versus what are the ones that actually truly address like structural, because that's going to be part of the challenge that we're going to have, is being able to decipher the two. So Raj, if you can move us on to item number 7.
Sure, thank you. 2010 Ad hoc Financial Recovery Committee, this was the aftermath of the 2008-2009 recession. They established the 6 key principles, if you will, which you see on the screen now. That's maintain a certain operating reserve, which is 15%, limit the use of capital funding for operations, control cost growth, achieve internal efficiencies, negotiate sustainable bargaining unit agreements, and explore the use of contracted services. These were the principles established by the committee, and what we have done, we did establish a reserve of 15%. It used to be at 15 till the beginning of this year, fiscal year 18. It's at 14% now for 2 reasons. Number one, we ended fiscal year 17 with a $2 million deficit, and the 18 budget went up, so the bogey to hit was much higher. We did not have that, or we do not have it, so it's at 14% right now. This was done about 2 years ago, 15-16 time frame. There was a time before which many of the transits did. VTA capital dollars, they were eligible to be used for example, midlife overhaul. However, that's an operating expense. The thought or the guidance given to us at that point was use capital dollars for capital, not for operating expenses, and we have done that. Control cost growth by making sure reasonably sustained funding source. We have done some of that. Number one was the fare increase, which we implemented at the beginning of this calendar year. When it's implemented fully, which is in fiscal year 19, we expect to generate about $6.9 million of incremental revenues from that. 2016 Measure B for Transit program, again, $12 million per year, only the portion for which we would use for increased service. And the 2000 Measure A operating assistance, we increased it from 18.5 to 20.75. And the retiree medical now is fully funded. Just a little bit of a history on the retiree medical. Way back in 2008, the Government Accounting Standards Board established or came up with what's called GASB 45. That was a new pronouncement pursuant to which VTA established a separate trust to fund retiree medical, what we call OPEB, other post-employment benefits. However, in 2008, it was not funded. The first funding took place in, I believe, 2012-13 timeframe, with an infusion of about $20 million into this irrevocable trust. Again, it was not fully funded at that point. 2015, it became fully funded. At the present time, it funded about 120% of what we need. Achieve internal efficiencies. I'm going to briefly talk about it, then I'm going to turn this over to Matt. Because this is the information I've talked about in the previous 2 or 3 presentations about how we have added only positions that are needed for safety, and we have actively managed the dollar amounts with that, and we have also refinanced existing debt where feasible for a savings of about $18 million or so. And we have also negotiated some of the investment manager and other contracts to reduce fees by about $700,000 per year. On the internal efficiencies, Matt Speakman, who's here with me, he's been with VTA's fellowship program, management fellowship program, for about a year. His task was to look at all of the efficiencies we can get, not all of the efficiencies, some of them, and also look at some of the data mining issues. And he has come up with some very interesting observations on some of the efficiencies which we can likely get. With that, let me turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Raj. Sorry. All right. Sure thing. Just to brief you all on my role here at VTA. As Raj mentioned, I'm part of the Management Fellowship Program. I was brought in to look at internal processes and identify inefficiencies, dive into our internal metrics to see if we can shed light on some glaring issues that are causing or that are affecting our core product and ridership, and then propose some recommendations moving further. And what I'd like to do today is to shed light on one of my findings pertaining to what Raj just outlined. In part of my analysis, I was able to identify that there's a trend relating to our operations productivity. That is our core driving hours that we are getting out of our operators and our core service. Specifically, those figures have decreased 5% since 2014. To give you a little context, productivity is again core driving hours, or scheduled time, the allowed time surrounding it, and subtracting any scheduled premiums and overtime premiums. In that same period, we've increased our pool of operators by about 7.8%, and it's also coincided with a couple of things: an increase in absences, and also an increase in missed pull-ups. That is, a ride not going out on time due to a shortage of available operators. Last point on this is that our gap between industry standard planned hours per driver and what we are achieving at the moment is 45 hours per quarter per operator. So there's a significant gap there. So the industry standard is an accepted term for an agency of our service level and size is 1,700 hours per operator per year. We look at quarterly, that's 425. Right now, we're at a level of about 380 based on our internal data. So as I mentioned before, our absences have increased over the last few years, and specifically over the last year and a half, we've seen a substantial increase in unplanned absences, as you can see on the graph listed there. Moving further, if we dive a little bit deeper, we look at the causes of some of these absences, you'll notice that there are some categories that have remained fairly flat over time, wavering just a little bit, but there are three, and I'll focus on two pools of absence types that have really increased over the last few years. One is sick hours, and the other is FMLA, that being Family Medical Leave Act of 1993. That could be many different things. It's often long-term, sometimes short-term medical or injury leave, family care, family bonding, and or chronic conditions. Yes?
I wonder if you factored into your data the actual living situations of your drivers.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And this is purely just the facts that we have in our core data set. This is not meant to be anything more than that. But I agree that there could be lots of external conditions that factor into these increases that we're seeing. One of which is living conditions, how far away people have to come, lots of things of that nature.
Is there any chance that you could maybe get those numbers?
Well, I think these are really just initial findings, and I think the next step that we would take in order to dive deeper into these trends is to conduct a more in-depth investigation as to the causes behind it. But that's absolutely something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, just looking at this, if I go back, I'm just trying to look at about 8 quarters or so. I mean, I know you're talking about the top 3 lines right there, but sure, 2 of those 3 lines are relatively consistent. The one that is the most significant change line there is training, which sounds like that's us. So it might be interesting to be able to see of the way your numbers are, to be able to kind of break out separately what is that training number, because I think that's it just as a percentage on or the one that's growing. That appears to be the one, at least in the last 8 quarters or so, that's growing. Those other ones, they're whatever they are, but they're not changing a lot from what it's been over the last 8 quarters.
Certainly, when you think about, when you consider volatility as well.
That's the one that's changing.
Right, this is part of a larger report and investigation. We can dive deeper into training on that front as well, but yeah, there are many reasons behind it.
And I'm not trying to say training, I'm just trying to say, it looks like training's the incremental factor, at least in the recent quarters.
Is there something that's driving that shift in the training? Do you know that?
The issue, one thing that I encountered in this analysis with regards to training is that the way that our training is coded is very general. So most of the theories behind the volatility of that figure are sort of anecdotal. It's new equipment, recertification. We maintain a very strict operator to trainer ratio that is maybe more strict than industry standard. So these are sort of more anecdotal ideas that have come up in my discussions throughout the agency. But in terms of the raw data, I wasn't able to produce that in a specific chart like this. That's something that I would propose we investigate much more thoroughly.
Thank you. Go ahead, continue.
So just in continuing with the theme of comparisons from a few minutes ago, and again, this is not a purely apples-to-apples comparison, but if we look at VTA compared with our neighboring agencies who are also experiencing some ridership decreases, we're at about the same levels in terms of absences, whereas if we look at somebody, an agency like Portland TriMet, who is achieving some increases in ridership, you'll notice that their absence levels are far less. So again, this is really just a correlation, but it's something that I found fairly striking. Additionally, FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, their portion of our absences has been increasing over time.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So your first line talks about Bay Area agency losing ridership. Do you also have in your study then, if you were to take another local Bay Area and add another column to this, do you have how we compare in 2013, 16, 17, and so far?
I do for, it's not every year that I have listed on there, and you'll notice there's 14 and 15 are suspiciously missing. This is pulled from various published reports. But I do have information with regards to BART, Muni, and AC Transit. Each of those agencies, Muni doesn't take into account certain things that we do, but as I sort of summarize in my bullet, we're right around the same level as those other agencies.
Okay.
Just because you listed those, you can't, then you need to change it. Not all Bay Area agencies are losing ridership with Caltrans as well.
Okay, right. And lastly, just another way of taking a look at trends in these sorts of absences. We can look at day of the week and how those trends have changed over time. And you'll notice that there's, in theory, the weekdays should be evenly distributed with these sorts of absences, or at least, in theory, and again, these are just the numbers. But we notice that Monday and Friday are significantly higher, especially Friday. And this is positively correlated with that same missed pullout figure that I brought up earlier. So again, this coincides with the loss of our core service, increased missed pullouts on Fridays compared with, related to Wednesdays, for instance. Anyway, those are some of the figures that I had to share with you. I welcome any additional questions.
Anybody have any additional questions? So I just wanted to highlight one thing. So Matt, thank you very much. Again, he's part of the fellowship program. And as I said, he's taken this work up to this point. And Matt now, unfortunately, is not going to be the one who's going to be able to do the deeper dive on, take the next look at this, because he will be leaving us. And I think today is his last day, and I want to, in a couple of hours. So Matt, I want to thank you for taking the time and doing this presentation and sharing your first level in terms of the information.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. You have 3 more hours left.
3 more hours. You're not off the clock yet, okay. Okay, Raj, back to you.
Yeah, just wanted to finish up this presentation. Let me take 1 more minute. This is an item 5, negotiate sustainable bargaining unit agreement. The last time around, whenever we negotiated the new contract for the represented group, we were able to transition all of the employees to CalPERS, which resulted in a savings of about $22 million for the contract period of 3 years. Also, that was the first time, there were pension contributions made by employees that also reduced the cost by about $4 million. There's a footnote there, footnote number 1. All of those savings were offset. In fact, the wage increase resulted in a net cost increase of $30.7 million. Explore the use of contracted services. This is something I talked at the beginning of the meeting. We have changed the paratransit delivery service from in-house. I'm sorry, we changed the contractors from that, but it's a little bit preliminary at this point to know what the results are. Once we have a full year number, audited numbers, we'll come back and report whether we were successful or not. So that concludes my presentation.
Yes, go ahead.
Raj, just throw that last slide back up there. Just, we were talking before a little bit about what is really a structural change versus, and of these 6 items right here, Are there any of these that you would truly consider a structural change?
Yes, the healthcare and the pension costs.
And Raj, if I may.
Go ahead.
Chair. So all the excuse me, all the refinancing is completed at this time, and so, is there any more bonds to be refinanced?
Not this year, but yeah, we can't, usually a refinancing opportunity occurs when these two conditions come into play. Number one, most of the municipal bonds have what's called a 10-year call option. So as we get closer to the call option, that's one. Second thing, the interest rate should be favorable. In other words, the interest rate when we're about to refinance should be lower than what it was when the bonds were issued. So we have taken, advantage of anything we could refinance, but we're constantly looking at it. There's another one I'm looking at right now, but the savings are very modest, in the sense that it's about $1.5 million. Reason we don't want to go to the markets, interest rates can change at a dime, but a lot of time, effort, expenses into that. By the time you go to the market, even if the interest rate change by a couple of basis points, you may lose all of the savings. So typically we target about 2% net present value savings before we embark on a refinancing.
Yes, so we've been, in the city, we've been very successful at refinancing our entire airport, $1 billion bond structure. We've saved millions annually, and so that's why I asked. How much debt do we currently have on record?
Overall, about $1 billion.
Thank you.
Raj, can you tell me, was it a $4 million savings on the pension contribution?
Yes.
That was what it was?
Yeah.
And that's annual, right?
No, over the 3-year contract period.
So how much per year is savings?
Oh, well, 1.3?
1.3?
Yeah, 4 divided by 3, 1.3.
Isn't that incremental? Doesn't it go up
Well,
incremental?
we are getting into a contract negotiation strategy session right now. Let me generically answer that. If the same contributions were kept in place for the next contract period, yes.
All right.
Okay, Raj, does that conclude your report?
Yes,
Are there
Madam
any
Chair.
other, okay, are there any other questions for Raj on this topic? Okay, if not, then, again, that concludes number 7. Number 8 has been deferred. So that moves us to number 9, which is responding to the outstanding requests that this committee has. The materials we requested are included in the packet, and Celia Pedrosa, our budget administrative manager, is here to answer any questions. Again, looking at the packet. Any questions? So, on our packet, we're on item 9. Yeah, so item 9, if you're into your packet, you go to item 9. You look at, we have pages, there's the graphics that look like this. There's 2 pages. There's 2 pages of this. That's what we're looking at. Okay. And so I don't know, did anyone get a chance to look at that before you came in here tonight? And then what you look at, there's page 1 of 2 and 2 of 2, which is the follow-on information. And then the next page, which has some green and some red ink on it, was what was, again, that was dealing with the regional service partners that we have. And I think that was answering some of the questions in terms of what our commitments are in terms of those agencies. So that is for the public that has the Caltrain, ACE, Capital Corridor, BART, and Highway 17 Express.
If I may, Madam Chair, this is similar to what you saw at the last meeting. It includes Capital Corridor, which would be in and left out last time.
Okay, so any questions for Celia? Gosh, you got off easy. So I think, okay.
I apologize apologize, I actually wasn't here the last meeting, and so I thought some of these questions were very good that were asked. One that was number 6, where signal prioritization. It's got long-term impacts. Are we moving forward with that? Are we talking to cities? Because I think that I recently did an interview with Mercury News on just this topic, and we were discussing not just this, but some of the other things we talked about to make our buses speedier, which is reducing some of the actual stops in general, and then also not doing dump or where the bus is having to unmerge and then merge into traffic. We should be doing this regardless of whether this deficit committee continues or not. I think it would be short-sighted of us not to continue down this path, because one of the reasons why people don't take the bus is because it's often slower than driving. And if we could speed up our service, we will encourage more people to take public transportation. So I don't actually see this as a should do. I think I see this as a must do. And that's all I have on that comment, but I thought the questions that were asked last time were very appropriate, so thank you.
And if I may just expand on that point, and thank you so much, Mr. Canvas, for raising that very important issue. What we've been doing is we've identified a series of efficiencies, both in bus and rail. I'll speak specifically to the rail. One of the areas that we have identified and are be able to deliver the type of service that customers have been sending us notes on is to be able to increase the speed. So we took care of the issues related to track and other deficiencies, and we've completed all of our slow zones. So that project is done. But one of the areas that is outside of our control is the signalization. And we recently had a meeting with the City of Santa Clara. I'm working with them. I already have a very positive report back from that meeting on what they're going to be doing to give us the signal prioritization that is necessary. But it really runs the gamut. If we look at the whole Tasman corridor, it goes through 2 other cities and is working with those other cities as well. When it comes to bus, and you're right, and I presume that there's some history, and Jim is still here, thank goodness, and I understand that Heidi is coming too, but there's some history regarding where we have the wells for the buses versus where they stop in the same lane of traffic. And some cities prefer that they not be in the same lane of traffic to allow for cars to go by, and others don't particularly have a preference. So that is something that would have to be discussed city by city, but Jim can elaborate on that. The solution that we found to speed up our buses was a dedicated lane, and we ran into a lot of challenges just implementing what other cities have embraced with open arms, which is the bus rapid transit program.
I just do want to say we've presented to the committees this last month our FAST program, which is exactly the types of techniques that you're talking about, transit signal priority, bus stop balancing, how we design our stops, and we're now reaching out to each of the cities to figure out how we can proceed and take those steps. So that we're also going to be bringing some policy development to the board around faster transit. So both our board and hopefully cities will adopt some policy language that gives us the ability to go into those cities and do those kind of things.
Yeah, I hope the city of San Jose is helping out in this respect, and if they're not, let me know. Okay. My hope is that I think that dedicated lanes are probably a no-go, because I actually see the dedicated lanes on Santa Clara, and one bus every 20 minutes is just, it's a waste of a lane. I don't think I would vote for that again. Just for the record, the other thing is that if we have improved the speed, I haven't seen any advertising media. I'd love to see like the Bionic Man theme song saying we're stronger, faster, cleaner, something like that. So it catches people's attention, because if they don't know you've speeded up the trains and the buses, then they won't try it. I think it's really important to focus on not just the new theme, which is VTA, the solutions that move you, just move you, we're moving you faster. I think would be important to start advertising that, since we are increasing our advertising dollars.
Another comment?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm not up on the FAST program yet, so can you talk about whether or not there are going to be gradations of bus lane marking or separation?
Well, we're looking at that as part of, in certain quarters, for sure, yes.
Okay, if there's no more questions, go ahead.
I have a question going back to the BART agreement. Is the current VTA operation cost included in the 2018 or 19 budgets? For the BART project?
You talk about the BART operational dollars and where that comes from.
Sure. If I understand the
The
question correctly.
VTA operation cost.
VTA operations cost for?
For the BART project, basically everything including at the BART stations outside of the DRIP, that falls on VTA.
Yes.
Are you talking, wait a minute, are you talking about money to BART for BART? You're talking about our service to support the BART?
The money that VTA has to pay for operating costs for the 2 BART stations outside of the DRIP, all the operational costs that comes into VTA.
Yes, so the question that he's asking, that some of us understand because we've been in conversations about this, but for the public to have the same common knowledge of what's going on, is that within the BART operating dollars, that's part of the 2008 Measure B, operating dollars that goes to both BART for operations and maintenance of the BART system, is specifically for the BART system. But that BART system includes what BART does within their right-of-way and within their station facility. Outside of the station facilities, it's the responsibility of VTA for maintenance of the transit centers, of the park and ride lots, of the parking structures. So the question that's being asked is, did our biannual budget that the board adopted in 2017, did that budget include what happens outside of what we have labeled the drip line of the stations?
Thank you, yes. To answer your question, yes, some of it, because when the budget was built, or was being built in 2017, actually it started in the end of 2016, at that point, the expectation was that BART will come into the valley sometime in September of 2017. And so, yes, some of those expenses were included in the budget, and that's why when we come back, or when we finish the year, we'll probably notice that the expenses are trending a little bit lower because the revenue service now has been moved to a future date.
Do we know what the projected amount is per year?
Well, I mean, it's, for example now, safety, security, we were going to ramp it up slowly. And annual cost, when fully ramped up, was about $4 million or so. And there are a few other expenses. I don't have all of the breakdown of the expenses, unless Celia probably may have. I'm sorry. Yeah, and the second thing, all of those funding would have come from 2008 Measure B, not from transit revenues. So I just want to make that clarification. In other words, just because those have been included, doesn't mean that has any bearing on the structural imbalance we're seeing, because that comes from a different funding source.
can we get a breakdown of what the projected cost is and how much of that is covered for Measure B and how much of that's gonna fall on VTA operating costs?
All of the costs related to BART operations, which VTA would incur, would come from 2008 Measure B.
So when we were, so let me do this, when we were looking at the charts, like the baseline charts and the assumptions, is anything related to 2008 Measure B in these charts that we saw today?
No.
Okay, so anything that has a,
No,
if it has
no.
a dedicated, anything that has that dedicated funding source for that specific thing was not in this baseline. So, but anything above and beyond, which is outside the drip line, is in. Is there anything outside of the drip line that? So like the bus service to connect to a BART station.
That's what I was going to answer. Yeah, that's in VTA transit budget, correct. So the bus service or the increased rail service, anything that would connect to BART, that's in VTA transit budget. And those things, since we are not implementing right now, has been deferred. But anything related to BART operation service, whether it's incurred by BART or VTA, would be funded through 2008 Measure B.
Is that clear, Steve?
Somewhat, because it's conflicting with other information I've heard in the past. So just specifically to the maintenance, our maintenance responsibility to the BART project for the VTA operations. My understanding is that not all of that's going to be covered by Measure B money. Is that correct or incorrect?
Again, we have to look at specific, functional areas and specific response. If it's related to BART, let's say VTA is providing either maintenance service or security service that pertains to BART service, that would be covered under 2008 Measure B. But not the rail or the bus service that connect to the stations.
Madam Chair, if I may, because since I do have, in full disclosure, I do have meetings with the collective bargaining unit, so the question has come up. I would suggest that we come back to this committee with the information so that we're all saying the same thing and there's clear understanding, because there's been a lot of misunderstanding, and it's not because we don't know what we're doing, it's because the law was very clear as to what that money could be used for, and we are getting interpretation.
Well, and can I just add, to make that slightly more complicated, so two things. One, I think having it come back and very concretely being able to designate what investments are going where, I think that's really critical. I think, Steve, the one point that you raised that I just want to lift up because I think it's important, although I don't think this is a budget breaker either way, is that the negotiations with BART over that Measure B pot are ongoing. So let me just, so that, I think, so some of the conflict is that we're still kind of fighting with them, honestly, with BART, about who's paying for what side of what line. But I just want to emphasize, I don't think it's a budget breaker, but I do think philosophically, as we look at the long-term issues that we've been discussing today, that really kind of defining what our investments will or won't be and the impact to VTA's other parts of VTA are going to be really important for us to kind of wrestle to the ground, because period, and then we can talk more around.
Yes, go ahead, Raj.
I think the question that Steve is asking is like this. Having been working on the BART project, you have the BART station, the roof drip line that we're talking about. That's the area that BART is going to maintain. VTA will pay for that maintenance, but there's areas outside that, the parking garage, the kiss and ride, the bus transit center, which is outside the station drip line, which we call the campus. So what I'm hearing from Raj is that the Measure B 2008 is going to cover the operations and maintenance for all those areas, whether they're within the drip line of the BART station or they're on the campus.
I think that's not what he's saying. I think that's partly why the staff is saying they've got to come back with some visual aids and some and numbers, because the answer to that is no. No, that's not what they're saying. But what we are in the process of doing is negotiating with BART over what what the limits are, what investments they can take, how Measure B gets used, so that we protect VTA's general fund. So I just want to say, I think it's really important the staff come back with a visual around what's being paid for out of what fund, that includes the visual around the drip line. Well, that's because I think they're saying the opposite, which is we've agreed to pay for everything outside of the drip line in big terms. But in little terms, like, I want to make sure that if VTA is being treated the same way every other station is being treated along the alignment. So where BART does invest, I want to make sure they're investing in us as much as they are anybody else along the alignment. So those negotiations are ongoing.
One more quick question. The Measure B funds from 2008, are they going to be sufficient as to not create more deficit for VTA for areas outside the drip line? Has VTA figured that out yet?
Sure. I mean, first of all, BART operations maintenance costs have no bearing on transit expenses because the funding source is very different. So to your question about whether the 2008 Measure B is sufficient to cover the BART's operating and maintenance, tax revenues plus the fare revenues will cover, based on the modeling we have done, and based on the current fare structure, phase one. And when phase two is introduced, or the revenue service commences on phase two, we have an understanding, and BART understands, we understand too, the fare structure needs to be reviewed to make sure. And secondly, the growth rate for sales tax, we have assumed a certain growth rate. So around 2023, 2024, or 2-3 years before phase two begins revenue service, we will have to assess, number one, the growth rates we had assumed for sales tax, were that realistic, number one. Number two, the fare revenues, do we need to add a surcharge, if you will, like BART does on their airport service now, to adequately meet the expenses? Yes, those have been modeled. That's kind of an iterative process, evolving process. We'll continue doing that.
But, I mean, just let me just highlight what you just said, because I think this is very significant, which is, we don't know the answer to the question for phase two. And so, as we, I mean, I just want to be more blunt about it, because I think that's part of the bigger picture discussion that we have to have, and I think that you know, when we're looking at that deficit number, you know, we're looking at that line, one of the things that we have to figure out is what can we afford, and that's a discussion.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so that now takes us to item number 10, which is roundtable discussion, okay? So a couple of things that I'm interested in. We need to be moving into where we all get to start our process in terms of trying to figure out what our recommendations will end up being, right? So we've heard some recommendations today, or I should say not recommendations. I'm going to restate that. That was totally bad on my part. What we heard today was some indicators of what one could expect. We kind of have a board of all these levers. If you start moving these levers, you kind of start seeing what kind of impact you can get. They're not recommendations, they're more like scenarios giving us a little bit of insight to what could be done. What we have, so we have some of that. We have answers to some questions. I'm trying to figure out which questions are going to be necessary for us to start evaluating options, okay? And we still need to brainstorm options. My concern right now is I'm trying to keep a list of all the questions that we have, and every time we go deeper and deeper into data, we're spending more and more of our meeting time getting information thrown at us and not us sitting here and starting to do our own thought process and trying to evaluate different options, okay? So I'm trying to understand, and what I'd like to do in this roundtable, part of this discussion today, is understanding what is the critical information, okay, that we think we're gonna need so we can produce some of the recommendations, okay? So I'm gonna kind of go through what I put in my little parking lot list, and I didn't capture all the individual little things, I tried to roll it up a little bit. And so if we can get an understanding of transit agencies, we said that we would like to see some additional transit agencies put into the presentation that we saw from Russ. I've heard Samtrans, I've heard Muni. Are those two sufficient, or is there another agency that
AC
you would?
Transit.
Huh?
AC Transit.
AC Transit.
Can we just include all local agencies?
Well, okay, so that's a broad statement, Ronnie, so I'm gonna challenge you a little bit. What does that mean? Do we wanna compare ourselves to a BART? Or do we wanna compare ourselves to those that provide similar service, which are the bus and the light rail?
Well,
Want Caltrain in there?
the reality is that every agency is unique to the Silicon Valley, right? And what I seem to, or the theme that seems to be put across is that labor is the issue. So if we cannot honestly assess what everybody's paying for labor, I think that's a non-starter. So you have to look at what everybody's pay, wages, and all of that other stuff, since what I'm seeing out of everybody's presentation is that labor is the #1 issue. So if you can't fully compare everybody's labor statistics, then I mean you're doing a disservice to the committee.
Madam Chair?
Just one moment. Raj, do
I mean, I believe in the last count there were about 27 Bay Area agencies. It may not be practical for us to compare all of that. I mean, we have to look at a statistically relevant sample size. We've already looked at about 7, 8 of those agencies, and 3 more were suggested right now. I mean, yes, agencies are all good. For example, BART has a fare box recovery in the high 60s to 70s, so does Caltrain. We have it somewhere in the 9.5 and going down, so I'm not sure whether it's really relevant to compare those agencies with VTA. Just comment.
Okay, so Christine, did you have a comment in terms of the agency, this agency question?
Yes, and I'll try to move the yellow. I'll put it into some better structure. As we look at the different transit agencies around the area, whether it's Samtrans or whatever, apples to apples and so forth, could we also possibly look at how they're working out or working with their paratransit systems, i.e. how they're structured in the sense of pay and other key factors that do impact how the systems are working and, in comparison to us. And I would never ever say that paratransit is a minor issue. I know that our focus is most on the fixed route, but this is the key thing. Thank you.
Okay, so let me go back. So again, I think it's important that we as a body all collectively agree on what that shopping list is. So I want to go back to the transit agency. So I think we got to ask ourselves, what do we think is really important, and how far we want to go with this. So if we compare ourselves to Muni, as an example, Muni's got light rail and bus service. And if I recall, because we don't have the data in front of us, their fare box recovery is probably more similar to ours, right? Is that, is it significant, I mean, is it significantly higher?
Yes. 3 times.
Okay. And then if we look at, so I'm trying to understand, I have to say for me personally, wage to wage comparison isn't dealing with the subject matter that we have, which is our structural deficit, okay? Because we've got different revenues and different contributions. I'm trying to figure out what is it really that's going to help us feel good about the task at hand, which is a structural deficit, versus some of the other things that we might want to know for other reasons outside of what the real scope of this body is. I'm not sure I'm being real clear on what I'm trying to say. So let me do this. I'm gonna put staff on the spot first, okay? I'm sorry, I'm gonna put you guys on the spot first. So, and actually, you know what? Maybe I really want to put Russ on the spot. How about that? We'll share this. Okay, we'll share the pain. So I'm just gonna take one agency at a time. In terms of the analysis that you've been doing and such, is there additional value from your perspective, not ours, but from your perspective, to add Samtrans into the picture? And I'm putting this Raj and Russ, the two R's. Because I don't want to go getting more data and I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question that we were trying to get is similar population areas, similar kind of services, and, I think we were also trying to get similar kind of geographics and demographics, which make a difference. So I think once you start to get variants of those, we see that a little, LA is kind of in there because they have similar kind of geographic, low density stuff. When you, spread out. When so that's even as a bigger area, it's a similar kind of service. When you start getting into very different types of service areas, I think the value of the data is less.
Go ahead.
Can I just weigh in for a moment? And Ronnie and Jason, and I know you brought this up earlier today. If you said you're the top three that we really want to make sure we're doing comparisons with, what would they be? Well, I'm asking Ron. You all have raised this at different times. I just want to make sure that because what would they be? And then very specifically the information we want would be to yield what?
Yeah, so part of the reason why we have some of these transit agencies on there is actually my fault. I think I pointed some of those out. I pointed them out, each of them basically for different reasons. Partly it was to try to look at the sources of revenue, right? Obviously we're talking about 83% sales tax-based revenue. So when you lump that in under local funds, you sort of don't disaggregate where the money is actually coming from. Are you getting the money from businesses? Are you getting it from incomes? Are you getting it from land? Are you getting it from usage, right? So that's why I included Chicago. I was looking at Seattle. The other thing that I was thinking about is different land use strategies and development. Just part of the reason why I included the Seattle and I included Denver. Looking at ways that you can drive ridership by the way in which that you increase your funding and the way in which you prioritize service.
Can I just add one thing to that, Ethan? Sure. And I think that the bigger question on those was, the other thing we wanted to be able to take a look at was the source of funds for all of them. Because I think one thing that's true about California is that we're different in the way that we choose to fund transit. I know Diana and Raj, you guys have been in other places, you know that. So I think the other question we asked was how they were funded. But Ethan, what I'm curious about is that was good comparison in terms of how we think about the future of VTA, but Ronnie asked a question very specifically about making sure that we understood the implications of living in this region. I think is really, Ronnie, was that the point that you were trying to raise?
Well, yeah, not just that, we saw in the graph work the direct correlation with missing miss-outs or missing pull-outs, right?
Yeah.
So, there has to be a direct correlation with the amount of wages that we make here, because people don't miss work when they need money, right? And the reality, I'm saying people don't miss work when they need money, but the reality is that the demographics of VTA, the employees here, a lot of your employees do not live in the area where they work, right? So that's why you may see a great variance of pull out, miss outs, whatever, and a lot of that is due to pay because it is so expensive to live here.
But Ronnie, is the information that you want the actual wage, the contracts from different regional agencies, or is it agency to agency looking at the whole comparisons as was presented earlier with a little more detail as was requested?
Both.
Okay, so then, if you had to choose 3 agencies, what would they be?
Why are we only limited,
Well, we could go to 10 or 100, but I'm just trying to get a sense so that they can get some work done. I'm just really trying to understand what the key ones are that we really want them to dig into.
Can I suggest 3 then?
Yeah, well, no, it doesn't have to be just 3, I was just
but-
using that to get.
Lisa, can you pull the mic closer?
Sorry. My suggestion then, to just look at the similar cost of living, similar sort of wages, and obviously similar labor pool, would be to look at AC Transit, to look at Muni, and then to look at BART. I understand that they have a higher fare box recovery, but they do draw from the same labor pool.
And then Sam Trans probably, you said San Mateo.
I wanted to add Orange County.
Oh, interesting. And, but did one of you say San Trans earlier or San Mateo? What's that? I was gonna suggest San
My
Trans.
recommendation would be not Samtrans, because they are having such a budget challenge that there's going to be a measure in November.
Well, actually, that's exactly the situation that we seem like we're in.
Okay.
So, in some ways, they're the most like us, and I'm kind of curious about it because of the work we're doing on Caltrans. I'm really trying to understand that.
Okay, so wait a minute, so we've got how many now? We've got AC?
5, right?
Yes, okay, repeat them.
AC Transit, Orange County, Sam Trans, BART, and what? And Muni.
Okay, so I don't want to go through these. Does everybody concur that we need to have all 5 of these? I told you my goal was to get it down to 3. How many people, I said 3. Okay, I mean, I was looking toward 3. Again, I could say it's artificial in some way, but as we kind of go, sometimes we go to get more data, then we just want more data again. So let's just do a show of hands. Does everyone feel it's really important to do all, so your 2 choices, all 5, or are you supportive of trying to reduce this down to 3? Okay, so those that think we need all 5, can you just a show of hands? Okay, and those that think we can reduce it down to 3. Okay, so I think what I'm going to say is I hate to do this. Can we get all 5 in a reasonable period of time?
Sure.
Okay. Maria, you're jumping.
And I appreciate that. I think it's very important to frame what the universe is. What I would ask of the ad hoc committee is that you provide us with what specific criteria you want us to look at to compare, because we'll look at all 5 and we'll come back, but we want to make sure that we are hitting on the mark the comparisons that you're interested in.
Okay, and that's what I was going to go next. So again, I think I got a lukewarm on reducing it to 3, but I got a more enthusiastic on 5. So we're going to go with the 5. Now, can we be more specific in terms of what is the comparison, what is the information that we're looking at? Does somebody want to take a stab or throw out what they would like to see in that?
Labor cost and service delivery costs.
Anybody else?
Well, I wanted them to do what they've already done, like,
So,
that's the horrible thing is that this doesn't include agencies that we thought should be included, so I want to do these.
Thank you, Tammy. So if we did the exact same charts, adding these, with these 5 agencies, is that what we're asking for?
We get a little bit more in depth with the breakdowns, and also include their funding sources, make sure we get their funding sources.
If we add funding sources to this. What else? Okay, so now staff, what else do you think we need to add to this, or are you comfortable with this list?
So, we can just talk a little about what we did have and what we presented.
Can we bring the slides, can we print this presentation back up? Which particular, pick a slide number so
Yeah, so slide, start with slide 11, that's the first comparison. Okay. So we did have sources of revenue, so I'm hearing is more of a breakdown. These are generic, kind of put together. We want to look at specific sources for these different types.
And I think when we were talking in the conversation, what I had heard was taking local and breaking local out more specifically.
Yeah, so
Was that the
local
only?
funds, right.
Okay, Cindy?
Yeah, let me just say that the taxes and fees levied by the transit agency, the local funds, and then the other directly generated funds, like those three categories are the categories that we have been asking questions about. Thank you.
The orange, again, the orange, the tan, and the green, we want more specificity on those three, is that what we're saying? Okay.
So, and I just want to, point out what we're gonna have to do with that, because it's not always broken down in the National Transit Database, we'll go to the individual budget, so, so we'll have that, to say it's kind of it'll be kind of two different sources, so it'll be by dollar for dollar, but it'll be, here's what they're.
So just so you guys know, we're gonna keep going through each of these slides this way. By the time we're done putting together our shopping list, the question I'm gonna turn over to you guys on that side is, how much time is it going to take to do this? Because we need to understand what that is, because that really affects our next meeting, right? Okay, so, next.
Okay, so then,
Progress.
yeah, next slide, we had fare box, I don't know if there's anything more you want on the fare box. You can keep going to the time it stops. On the expense side, we had cost per, the passenger trip. What I heard is that we can get that as a breakdown of that by, different operating costs, right? Wages, maintenance, and that kind of breakdown. Right, just like, like this, like slide 16, like the same kind of breakdown.
And the pause, that's what I believe Glenn had asked for, so we all agree on that? So again, go back one. So this one here would be the same slide, except the bars, instead of being solid blue, they would be multicolored. Stacked bar chart. Okay. Okay. So, and then we'll back up, Tammy. So is that what we're asking for here, guys? Okay, you guys got that? Now, Tammy, you want to back us up one slide?
Yeah, I had asked for previously the line by line of all the expenses, because we didn't have these categorized or described.
I'm sorry. She wants a detailed expense.
VTA's budget?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's on our website, the complete budget, but with all the.
No, not the budget, line by line, though. Is it in the line by line? Or is
The
it-
budget is, so if you want that, you can pull it off the website, the budget, and then it's clear in terms of those categories, correct? So you will see it by those categories.
I'm gonna break up the categories.
What do you mean you want to break up the categories?
I think she's saying they will, like if you go there, they'll say labor.
Okay.
Just for clarity, this is what you have on the website.
So,
There's a line item on expense and revenue.
So Raj.
Years before, it's been pages, it's not just one page summary, so that's why.
So Raj, when you look at that,
Yeah.
take one of these wedges of this pie, and what would you be able to see off of that one pager?
Labor cost.
And so,
There's labor cost.
But it doesn't tell me what's operators, what's maintenance, what's human resources, it doesn't say all of that. And,
so you want it broken out by labor type?
yes. And maybe it's more important for the VTA budget that way and not so much the other agencies, but I do want to compare that, because when you say what, our operations costs are, well, they could have a HR, staff of 5 and we could have one of 50. So there is a difference, and I want to see that. I don't know how best to see that, but I don't want to be completely unreasonable, but I think that it matters on what our projections are.
Go ahead,
I'm
Mary.
just trying to ascertain what is the significance of that.
Because that affects fair market revenue.
But I think
The fair,
what Tammy wants to be able, no, it's not that. I mean, here's I think here's what the challenge is that look, we just told people that one of the best ways to change the agency was to contract out a bunch of jobs, right? And so, I mean, I'm not, look, the elephant in the room was just, there's a level of tension in the room that we need to address. I mean, you happen to be the deliverer, but whoever's sitting there would have gotten the same set of goals, right? So what I think that folks want to be able to be assured of is that the decisions that we're making are good decisions in terms of how we're spending money, number one, and number two, what are the implications of the way we've structured the budget? So what I would just suggest is, I know there's a budget book that you give us that isn't, it's not a, I don't think it's position by position, but I think it's clustered by unit, by department, and we get that as part of the budget process. And so what we should ask is that that be just made available to us, and probably for at least the agencies that are in our area, is just to get their same budget books that they use to vote on. Okay. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm just gonna add one more to this. Yeah.
That breakdown is in the budget book for each department. For example,
Yeah,
finance
that's right.
is a breakdown by line item.
That's
and
right.
We have that in the budget book, so.
I know, the thing is that
Yeah.
we sent her to the website. The website doesn't have that level of detail unless the book is actually.
The
Oh,
budget-
I haven't looked on our website, okay.
Okay,
So if the book's there, we'll take a look at it. Okay, so what I would suggest, if I can, what I would suggest is that if there, so two things. We should take a look at that and see if that makes sense and if there's more information that we need. What I would just request is that if we can get that same information available to everybody here in little book form, so everybody can mark up their own book, and then look at what's available for at least two of the agencies that we talked about, because I do think Sam Trans, I'm not sure about Barb, but Sam Trans and Muni are gonna be good ones for us to compare those.
Right, so that's what I was gonna ask Tammy, were you asking for this for just VTA's breakdown? Were you looking at for all 5 agents or something in
I
between?
don't need all 5 agencies, but I definitely need BTA and a couple of agencies, because it matters when we compare it to all those other things. Labor, looking at benefits, all of those things matter, and we should know what kind of agency we're comparing ourselves to.
Okay, if it's not all 5,
It doesn't have to be all 5.
She's not that.
you're right, it doesn't have to be all 5. Which one or two would you want to put? So what I don't want to do is, I don't want staff coming back and they give us these 2 and we say, oh, wrong 2, it should have been another 2. So I want to give them a fighting chance to deliver what we're asking for.
Can I think about it for a minute?
Anybody else want to weigh in? Ronnie, do you want to weigh in on that one? So you know what, so there's a couple of ways we can do it. So I don't hear us saying that we want staff to put these side by side. They're all gonna be structured probably slightly different and such.
Very different.
So we have a couple of choices. So one thing that we can do is, if we think we want to mark up our own, I could say, staff, give everybody a hard copy of ours. I could also ask staff to say, for all the other 5 agencies, find the web link that gets us there and send it all to us, so all of us would take personal responsibility to go in, look at those things, rather than have them print off or do any further analysis. So would that meet the objective that we have here, is if we said staff will give us, we'll call it the hard copy of our budget book, and links to all 5 agencies for where their budget books are. Would that work? Does that meet our needs or not?
I don't know how easy their stuff is to print, so I don't know.
Do you want printed copies of all?
Oh, I didn't want all 5, but.
Again, I'm trying to manage what we're, I'm not trying to pass judgment on the request, I'm just trying to crystallize the request. Do you want to try?
I suggest that we get the AC Transit and the Muni budgets, and then for the Samtrans budget, since it's a lot smaller, I can disseminate some of that information and make it easier to deal with, right? And I think I should do that.
We will do as you say. One of the things I just wanted to highlight is that we and the board has adopted through our budget a sustainability program. And we'll be happy to provide documents as requested here, but we, as most of the board members, we're moving towards electronic communications.
Yeah, so that, and you beat me to that. So, does everybody really want a hard copy of our budget book, which is, hold up the document. Does everybody need a hard copy of that?
Yes.
Anybody not want? Who was happy with just going electronic? So can you guys do that so that, I don't wanna kill any more trees than we have to here.
That's fine, but just to be clear, what we have on the website is exactly the same thing. We'll be happy to print 20 copies of that.
So the other,
If the board does not.
or the other option is everyone, if you want it printed, you're gonna print it yourself.
It's more important for me to see it printed. I mean, I have the other years from 10 years ago to compare to. It's much easier to have the printed one. And when I print, my printer doesn't print the same as it looks on your printout. It just doesn't.
Okay. Not a problem.
Okay, so if you want an actual book, who wants an actual book? Did staff capture that? So keep your hands up so staff can do that. If your hand is not up, you're going to just get the electronic link. Got it? Okay.
I saw 3 unless I forgot.
Elaine says, yeah. Elaine got it for us. And now, in terms of the AC Transit and Muni, can we all do that electronically? Because we don't actually have those in our possession.
We can provide a link to that we can do it.
Can everyone get the link to that? Okay. Why don't we just try those two, or actually give the links to all 5 agencies. So all we're gonna print is the printing of ours for the people who have a show of hands.
Okay.
Okay, is that fair? Is that reasonable? Okay. That was the first item. Okay, so, covered that one. So when we talk about the cost of living, is it clear what we're going to get on cost of living from these, or do you need more clarification?
Well, there are cost of living indicators that show, relative cost of living to, a base of, a base. So everyone can see, you can see each city's cost of living. So, that's what we'll give you. So we do that all the time in other work that we do, so we have resources for that.
Everybody good? Okay, moving next. Then we had a conversation about the baseline forecast. And I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, I thought I heard a couple of, so just talking about the baseline, can we bring up that slide? The baseline forecast. I heard 2 things. One is having that slide, that particular slide produced with SB, because right now it does not include SB1 operational dollars, but doing one that does include SB1 operational dollars, so we can see if we're optimistic, and even though that's not until November that we'll know the answer to that one. So one is with that. Then I think, Johnny, because of yours, I'm wondering, were you also asking for the baseline that is a true worst case, or closer to a true worst case, which means one without the Measure B operational dollars in it?
Well, look, I've actually read the budget, and I don't need to be convinced that we're in a budget deficit situation. I'm not skeptical that we're gonna be missing the budget projections. So I don't necessarily need a whole new presentation, but if you wanted to do a real worst case scenario where SB1 falls apart and Measure B falls apart, you could, just for the consumption of the group. I just merely said that to provide reference that this is actually not the worst case scenario that I envision.
So again, I'm trying to understand, and I, on this, this one, I'm not necessarily saying we're gonna have a presentation on this piece, it's just, we'll add it to the slide deck. So what is the pleasure? Do we need any of either of these or not?
Well, can I make a request related to this, Chair, which is that for each thing that could possibly save money, can we just see them side by side?
Yeah.
And then it would, might be simple to add.
That's my next one.
Oh, okay.
I wanna go back.
But SB one could be one of those things, so it could be both on the revenue and expense side.
Okay.
So we don't have to 16 chart. Okay.
Okay. Staff, are you clear? Then again, the slides, if we could get an updated on all the forecasts, so slides 33 to 44, do all of those with a side by side, okay? And then we also had a request, and again, these requests, when we put them out in the moment, please, we need to figure out, are they really pertinent to the work that we're gonna be doing? But the other request was, in your slides 25 through 30, which were the other agencies, basically talked about other agencies and their actions. There was a question as to when those occurred. So if they occurred real recently, and we don't have, so we know that we have no understanding of the impact versus what was in there and lines up with the dates that we have. So is that relevant? Is that something that's critical that we all need to know?
Well, so Glenn's not here, so what Glenn was asking, I thought a very good question, which is, so yes, I think the answer to that is yes. I think particularly where you had actions that were of significance from a revenue perspective. And I think just broadly, the bucket A is what happened during the recession as a result of the recession and people course correcting. And then more recently, what's happened is we've seen transit continue to drop, what agencies of course corrected there. So I don't think they have to be the exact second, but I think understanding those tranches of activity is probably very significant.
Ms. Bloom, I would also ask, can we just get a breakdown of what actually goes into these deficits?
Okay, and yes, and I actually have that as these were not in any particular order, they just have to be note-taking, so that's why notice I keep jumping around. So the next one then, got the other agencies, if we could get a summary slide that would show what are the key assumptions that are in here, okay? So, like the wage, wage we assumed X, and then if you can get an annotated one, when you put the side-by-side bars, if you could also annotate it, so it went from 3.5 down to whatever. So again, we have one, it's all the information's on one. Is that okay? Is that correct? So again, and then any other significant assumptions that went into there. So it's very clear, so the slide could stand alone, okay? What's in and what's not. Okay. I think that's what I had on my list. I know we asked a lot of other questions such as, have we considered, are there any other sources of revenues that we can or should be considering? And then again, the team, in our next meeting, once I figure out the structure of this, we're also going to be able, that opportunity for us to look at what other things we want to consider. Unless you have something specific here that you think you would like staff to try and work on before our next meeting. Yes, go ahead. Well, you know what? This is a roundtable. Anybody who wants to talk, let's not talk over each other. But it's okay, because you know what? Every group this size needs somebody to break the ice each time. So go for it.
So on the revenue sources side, I'd be really interested in figuring out exactly how AC Transit was able to get so much of its revenue from property taxes, including parcel and general taxes, specifically the measure PV that passed in 2016. Then I'd be really interested in figuring out whether or not the legal and programmatic feasibility of the real estate transfer tax, looking at whether or not there's any revenue to be drawn from that. And then I'd be be also interested in, I'm sure everyone's aware, there's been a lot of talk around whether or not there's a way we could price rideshare companies or any emerging trends in mobility. And obviously in New York City and Massachusetts and Chicago, they've been able to put either per ride or overall. There are some issues in California around California Public Utilities Commission, but we'd like to maybe get an analysis of that and see whether or not it's feasible.
Can I just to say to that, because one of it's a question, the deeper we go in some of these things, if we can get it from National Transit Database or budgets, that's something that's pretty easy. If we have to start really asking questions of people, we've tried to reach out to a lot of the finance directors, they're in their own budget time. We're not getting it, so it's a tough time to get people to pay attention to someone else's problems. They're kind of all dealing with their own.
Hey, I totally get it.
Yeah, but I'll just say, as it relates, especially specifically revenue sources from other states compared to California, California has such specific and such constrained, ability to generate revenue.
Oh, I hear you.
So one of the things when you're talking about any kind of tax has to go to a vote of the two-thirds, no matter who it is. And then Prop 26, which was regulatory, if you have a fee, if it's not directly related to regulatory actions, is a tax and has to be voted on. There's also something that's coming on this year's November as well, which is like everything is a tax. Doesn't matter what it is, it has to be voted on. We've been going down that. Yeah, and at 2/3. So just to say that in terms of if I prioritize where we would go, that has the least value because it's like, look at this, like I said, Portland does income tax, would that be great? Well, you can't do it here because the state
Absolutely.
that's right.
Can I just put a little bit of context in this? Which is that we keep passing revenue measures in Santa Clara County from 1976 to the last year. But magically, the amount of money going to basic and core services keeps going down, right? So from 1976, it was a half-cent sales tax measure. We get roughly half the budget from that, $200 million. Last year, 2016, it was also a half-cent sales tax measure, another $200 million. We only get 8% of that. That passed by 2/3. Measure VV in Alameda County, I don't think they're stingier than we are, also passed by over a 2/3 majority. It passed by 80%. I think we have to start realizing, or at least looking at, why we keep getting into this problem, and whether or not we're actually asking the residents and the taxpayers and the landowners and the companies in this county to help support the transit that we all need and depend on. So I get your point, I understand it's difficult, but I think we should perhaps put it on our work plan as a potential source of revenue, since it's the only revenue we actually rely on right now. So.
Jump on in.
Well, I think most people will know where I'm coming from. I'm not crazy about new taxes. We just passed, and I supported the half-cent sales tax for VTA. I'm supporting the new measure for money on the bridge tolls. We just keep going to the well. We did an 8 cents for BART. We did a measure A. We did another one for BART. At some point, we have to start delivering. And this is not a revenue from the taxpayer issue to me. This is a managing the money we have issue. And if we don't fix our structural problems in the best of times, this is not the worst economy here. We've been on the upward swing for 10 years. And if we have deficits in the best of times, how are we going to deal with it when we have an economic downturn? We can't keep going to taxpayers and telling them to pay more and then promising them more services like we did in Measure B, and now we're talking about just using that money to support our existing services. It is not logical, at least in San Jose, we're already at maximum sales tax revenue. We would have to go to the state legislature to turn that around. So it is not possible in the city of San Jose. The city of San Jose has 1.1 million people, so it wouldn't work without our city. So spending a lot of time on new tax measures is absolutely gonna go nowhere. Besides, it takes almost a year to get a tax measure up and running, unless you want a special tax, and then you know how well, a special election on a tax, which is requiring 2/3, and then I think you understand that special elections don't bring out the same very liberal voters that you would get. So having staff focus a lot on new tax measures is absolutely not beneficial to the conversation. I think we need to take a look at what the real problems are. First of all, fare box recovery is horrific. And that at 8%, if all you saw that, it's the worst in the nation, most likely. It's the worst in the nation. That is something, something that we need to actually look at. How the heck are we gonna get more people on transit? If we don't fix that, we're gonna continue downhill slide, we're gonna lay off people, we're gonna keep trying to ask for more money, and of course, eventually, some people will start saying no. A lot of people, I'm not here to blame employees, but you can't look at the whole pie without looking at the largest figure. It's 61.7% at the expenses. You can't look at the, and I agree with looking at the entire pie, but that's 61.7%, and if you're asking us to ignore the largest piece, it's a disservice to this committee. So I think a lot of these recommendations, for me, a couple of them are no-brainers, where one union is not paying into the pensions at the rate of all the other unions are paying. We should just go forward with that. Well, I know it's only fair to all the other unions, and I understand that it will cause pain to some people, but we need to keep the system afloat. And so it doesn't matter how much statistics that we're gonna get from other cities and what other organizations we're gonna look at, we're still facing a budget deficit. And we could take a look at what our other cities and other transit agencies are doing, but it won't, all that exercise won't necessarily help us solve the budget problems that we currently have. It might give us some ideas on what other cities and agencies have done, and we already have some ideas. So, rather than prolonging a lot of the pain, I would rather just start working on the nuts and bolts. But I'm okay with going one more meeting and getting more information. But I don't think we should continue with this meeting structure past June and asking for more and more and more information without actually making some recommendations. I'd like us to start making recommendations, to start putting our thinking caps. It's gonna be painful. It's gonna be painful regardless. And I'm not the kind of guy who likes to sugarcoat things. I'm a straightforward guy, and it's gonna be painful for everybody. I think the one question that was asked by Tammy that I thought was interesting was, and I think she was trying to allude at this, how much is in administration versus actual people, driving buses and fixing buses. I didn't think that would be a fair kind of thing to look at. If we're administration top heavy, if you will, I think that's it would be. I think that's what she's really alluding to in wanting all the numbers on the budget, and I think that's an interesting question. But I would rather start looking at what we can actually achieve together, and then start working on it. I think talking about brand new taxes in an era where we just passed a brand new tax, we have a current tax on the ballot, and we're actually fighting to keep two other taxes from going up in smoke. It's kind of an exercise in futility. Those are my thoughts, and that's it.
Okay, Cindy, I'm gonna vote. Actually, can I go to Gabe first?
Certainly, Madam Chair. I just want to echo the council member from San Jose's comments that having data to benchmark is great, But I'm concerned that we're creeping up on our timeline to come up with some recommendations, and I'm concerned that we may find ourselves as a group is trying to rush through some of those because of the timeline to get those. And I just believe that, I think, I agree, you know, being in local government, you know, us cities, we all struggle with how we're gonna provide services. I think key to that is living within our means, and there's difficult decisions we have to make, and difficult policy decisions that the governing board has to make. But ultimately it comes down to what can we afford, what do we have, what's our revenue measures? And I would agree, you know, going to the taxpayers is very difficult in today's environment. You know, there's a potential ballot initiative to repeal the gas tax, SB1, Measure B is being challenged. And I think that for us to rely on additional revenue measures that the voters have to approve is concerning. And so I just think that, you know, we need to start talking about the nuts and bolts of the crisis we have. It's not gonna go away. I think looking at other transit agencies is good for benchmarking purposes, but at the end of the day, we only have so much revenue and we have so much cost to deal with. So, you know, I like I said, it's more of a comment, but looking at where we're at today and the time we're under, I'm just concerned about how much time we're actually gonna get to spend in looking at the recommendations to address the structural deficit.
Anybody else before I go to Cindy? Raj?
So I have a question. I've noticed that at this agency, we keep on building new extensions, but where's the money to do the maintenance? Why do we keep on building? If we don't have equal amount of money to maintain a structure, I give an example. We're just building the park system, the extension here. Now I'm hearing that the money to maintain that may or may not come. We are already jumping on to phase 2. I'm not clear what is the business model that our agency has. If we were to build $100 worth of extension, we should have $100 worth of money set aside to maintain that on the onset. I think that's why we are in what we are. It's not because of labor. I mean, labor is going to live in this area and work, provide the service that's expected out of us. But every deficit that we experience, it's the labor that's getting hit every single time. Doesn't seem fair. I think some responsibility, I would say major responsibility, has to be borne by the management of this agency. The workers here, the operators, the maintainers, they're not doing the management. Somebody else is. But the operators and maintenance always have to take the brunt of the mismanagement of the agency. We saw that in 2010, we're seeing it now. And if the structural budget goes the way it is, you can see what the numbers are going to do. We're going to be out of service. So the point I'm trying to make is that all the extensions that we're working on now, we need to have the right amount of money set aside from day one when we get a capital budget for an extension towards maintenance and operations.
So Rajan, I can take that and let me turn it around a little bit. Are you asking, we have a capital plan, okay? The capital budget is different, but to Raj's point, are you asking, do you want information? Do we need information? Maybe I should do it that way. That deals with looking at all of our capital projects that we have planned, understanding what the projection is for each of those in terms of what their operational, their O&M costs are going to be. Are you asking for that as another piece of information?
Actually, I'm not asking for that. I'm just suggesting that every extension, every addition to our system that we make, it should be thoroughly analyzed what the capital budget is, what is the operation and maintenance cost for that capital budget going to be. If you don't have that, do not do that capital extension.
Okay.
Okay, we keep on doing that mistake over and over. I mean,
So I'm hearing you say that you want to, that's probably one of them where you want to put your peg in terms of one of these suggestions when we start putting together our solutions.
I mean,
one of them is saying,
you're asking me
to discipline on that.
I want to buy a car, but I don't have money to run the car or maintain the car. That's what we're doing. I mean, that's a management issue, that's not a labor issue. That's all I'm trying to say.
Okay. So, I want to address both the point that Gabe and Johnny just raised, and then what I want to do is redirect our conversation just to kind of next steps. I think the reality is that, at least the length of time that I've been involved with working on transportation probably has been since 1990. And the 3 points I want to make about the situation we're in that I think both relate to, Gabe, actually something that you raised in the community that you represent, and something that Johnny, that you said earlier. First is that in a number of the most recent ballot measures that we have considered, we have not had a policy at our board that requires the maintenance to be built in to the measures. And that, I just want to remind you that as we're having a discussion right now, and many of us are, about Caltrain and the investment in Caltrain, the investment in Caltrain that's being considered by folks who are organizing the ballot, or thinking about that ballot measure, is money that is flexible for the institution to use for both operations and maintenance. And that's not how we've approached this. So the frustration around the table, at least for me, as I was listening to in terms of how many taxes and what we're taxing people to do, really is whether or not the institution has learned quickly enough what the implications are of building without building in operations and maintenance to the ballot measures themselves. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that if in fact we ran VTA like a business, we would have no alignments off of East Santa Clara Street. If all of VTA would go from Alum Rock all the way to Palo Alto, and it would not go to Gilroy, and it wouldn't go to any neighborhood, and it wouldn't go to Almaden Valley, because those aren't cost-effective routes. If we're thinking about this from a straight, let's do it like a business. And really, you're right, we could stop the meeting now and say, you know what, we're gonna have about 42 buses, and they're gonna go down one alignment, and we're gonna connect as best we can BART to a few light rail trains. But, so what I think that means, what I think that means is, that brings me to my third point, which is this. When we had the ad hoc committee in 2010, the reason that we had that committee, and we've had one before that I was involved in, is that those all were around a look at what we were going out to the voters to ask them for. And they were convened at the time, frankly, labor and you were something, before you were the leadership group, you were the manufacturing group. And so it was a manufacturing group. And it was done with the intent, and I think this was actually really good intent, was to help have investments in transportation and creating what we hoped would be a better business climate, or I think was a big part of that. And for those of us who were focused on social justice, it was also a way to move people who were poor. So I say all of that only to put in context why we have to finish having these discussions, because every time we've had these discussions, they've been driven by a single event, a budget or a ballot initiative. And that's actually not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is building up, even if a piece of these recommendations go to addressing the current budget deficit, and by the way, it's not a structural deficit, it's a budget deficit, by the current budget deficit, in order to not get into a structural deficit, we need to make some core changes in the way we finance and the kind of services we provide, and what services we should provide in the future. I'm not saying I know the answers to those things, but the opportunity that we have with the crisis is to get everybody around the table to kind of say, here's what we should be looking at. For example, one of the things we should be asking ourselves is whether or not VTA needs to put a policy forward that says, we're not going back out to the voters without X percentage going to O&M. I mean, that's a choice, right? That's something we can bring forward. So, and the only other thing I would say is I feel that, I know everybody's tense and feeling frustrated. I actually don't usually get frustrated in these kinds of meetings. I think I've been through them too many times, but I even am feeling a little right now. And I'm putting that out there just to make the following point, which is ultimately we've had, since I've been here, many general managers, and actually no one sitting here today was sitting here in 2010. And they weren't sitting here in 2002, and they weren't sitting here in 1976 when we did the first tax measure. And that I know of. And I say that because ultimately, the responsibility rests with all of us, and in particular, with the board. And I'm taking responsibility for that. Like, I've made some really great decisions, things I feel excellent about. In hindsight, some no bueno decisions, right? So this is iterative, and we're gonna, we believe, I think most of us, that we wanna say VTA, that it has value to all of us. Some of you because it's your livelihood, some of us because for social justice reasons, some people because of environmental reasons, some people because of business climate. So with that being said, I do have some information, and it may not even be information we need from you, but these are areas that we need to examine collectively. And one of them is the last thing I talked about, which is, do we need a policy that at least frames out when we're gonna have a conversation with voters, what we're using that money for? Number one. Number two, and I think this is very important, and actually, Donnie, you reminded me of this. If we need to better understand what the climate is, if we're funding Caltrain through voter engagement, and if ultimately we look at funding a continuation of investment in BART through that engagement, because we need to better understand what the system impact is for VTA. And the other question we have to ask ourselves is, would we support ballot measures that do not have revenues coming back to VTA as the core connector? So does it make sense for us to invest or support a ballot initiative for Caltrain that doesn't have a rate of return coming back to VTA to get buses connecting to Caltrain or to deal with that last mile? And same thing we ought to be thinking about with BART or the extension of BART. That's a policy question. It's one I would want us to frame up for the board so we can have a discussion about that. Second is the issue I raised earlier about whether or not there should be a range of percentage range that we look at for any ballot initiative that looks at operations as well as construction. Two is, as we look at the changing nature of transit and transportation in general, what kinds of ideas, themes, or approaches do we need to look at for congestion management? In particular, would we ever look at congestion pricing? Does it make sense for VTA to maintain all assets, meaning all right-of-ways, so that we have an opportunity to engage in a rate of return for congestion management? Or, do we want to look at franchises and partnerships with cities around ride shares, shuttles? Because we've not done that, and in the past, that's exactly what we did with the taxi industry, and we did it for a reason. But with new innovations, we've sort of created a whole new sets of rules that have negatively impacted our ability to partner with these kinds of organizations. And then, this is something that I've been really focused on. I will say that ASIN, because he's smarter, says this in a different way than I do. But I have been very interested in understanding how public entities can, if appropriate, commercialize data. Because we have allowed the private sector to do that, even though in many respects we're going to be the biggest collectors of data, and we have the physical infrastructure today as we address technology to be making a higher rate of return, I think, than just letting something be on the standard pole, right? A repeater or whatever those smarty pants things are. And then the last thing I just want to focus on is, again, something that Johnny raised. And that is, we have to really figure out a better way to have an opportunity to weigh in on land use policies that negatively or positively impact transit. Because when cities are doing what they should do, which is listening to their constituents, but if there's no incentive, transit coming their way, or financial incentive, or if we're not going to send a bus, if we're going to make investments annually in city X, Y, or Z running their own bus system, that money has to be contingent on signalization, as Johnny raised, or other land use considerations that make it more possible for us to manage congestion, because people expect us to do that. So we've got the responsibility without the authority, and we've got to close that gap. And I think the way to do it is through incentives. I don't think it's brutalizing cities, but it is creating options for cities. And then I know we've been looking at our fare policies for a while, but Clipper Card, Easy, you know, I wonder whether or not there's an opportunity for us to monetize our partnerships with other entities through a shared ticket or shared fares, right? So if you come into town and you're coming from X and you're gonna take a taxi to Y, and we're the ones who line that trip up, and we're doing enough of those trips, is ever there enough rate of return that we can get investment? And I think it's just important that we look at those things, because the private sector is right now, the difference is they're looking at the public sector entities as a way to subsidize their ability to make money. And we're not doing it the other way around. And I think there's value in us thinking about that. And that could very much be through public-private partnerships where there's a shared rate of return. But just to remind everybody, even though Uber was up on those charts, they're not making money yet either. And so we've got to remember that as we think about how to make investments. You know, obviously, the last thing I'll just say is that it's hurtful to me to see that the way we would be dealing initially with our deficit is with money that we had to fight to have in the ballot measure for poor people, that we're now going to need to we're going to have to look at how that money gets invested, because it's such a small portion of that ballot initiative, and it's the only money that is really for operations, that we're not able to focus on the people that we initially intended to at the level we're going to intend to. I know we're going to live to the spirit of and the letter of the ballot measure, but for those of us who were fighting for even more, this was an opportunity to spring off of that money, and that's really not where we're at. So as we proceed, and I'm just picking on you, Gabe, because you're out of the left corner of my eye here, but like if we were to make changes to low-income communities who need bus transit, I know we have the federal guidelines of how we have to look at being equitable and fair and all that, but what we may need to look at is whether or not we have a higher moral standard here than the federal limited, I would say, limited, it's not a limited analysis, it's an intensive analysis, but I'm not sure that it meets what we're really trying to do here in the countywide, and we should take a look at that. And if VTA wants to get out of the business of doing that social service work, that is a conversation we need to have with cities and the county in the near term. And I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm just saying that that's something for the board to consider at some point as well. And I'm sorry that's a lot, but I have some of it written down and some of it's just up here. Sorry about that.
Okay, we've been going for 3 hours now. Is there any other request that we have of staff or our consultant?
Just a couple more, sorry, I didn't.
Go for it.
So, you mentioned the idea around TIFs, and like you said, who knows how much money there's in there, but you know, we have a lot of like big developments happening that are near a lot of transit and stations that we're investing in, and I'd be really interested to find out what kind of value capture is possible in those areas.
I mean, TIFs are usually associated with huge and large capital projects.
Right.
Building a station, building an extension. Absolutely for, you know, I mean, yeah. Not trying to Monday night quarterback this. I was not around when phase 1 funding plan was built. But for phase 2, absolutely we're looking at that. I just want to take a minute, if I may.
Yes.
To answer Roger's questions about ballot measures. The right way of looking at a ballot measure is to look at a life cycle cost of a project. Life cycle cost includes construction, operations, and maintenance over 30 or 50 years. That's the right way of looking at that. But somebody already bought the car. So we're trying to see how we're going to fuel the car, how we're going to maintain the car. I totally understand what we should have done or what perhaps was the best thing to do, but unfortunately that bus now has left. So
I have a couple more. Sorry, just a couple more. So I was really excited to see the joint development documents in the presentation, and I love that estimate that, you know, we're getting $3.5 million a year by before, and it could grow to, I mean, I can't remember the number, but in the tens of millions possibly, within a couple of decades. Is there any way to speed that up at all? You know, is there any way to I mean, obviously we have a representative from the city of San Jose here. Are there any ways that we can sort of partner with these constituent cities to where we can sort of approve more of these joint development projects that seem like they're pretty good revenue drivers?
Well, given we have one city person here who would love to comment on this. Well,
So just to let you know,
this one first.
First I wanted to thank Cindy. She's a wealth of knowledge, and I think she brings a perspective that I often find very educated and intelligent. I wanted to first say that we already approved several projects. One on Tamian that is already been cleared. Now, we have no control over how fast these things get built. And I'm sure that VTA hasn't gotten a single dollar until these things are actually built. So often projects, and I wish, you know, we're doing a lot of homeless housing, and we approved 1,000 already, homeless housing projects. But from the time we actually say yes to the time we open the doors, it's usually 4 years. So counting on these land lease deals, I think it's for it to help us in the next 2 years, budget deficits. It's just not going to happen. Maybe in the future, right? It will help. Another thing I want to get back to. I think Cindy made a lot of interesting points, but many of them, like I agree with her on the policy on operating budget when we do new ballots. And I think I support her on many of the suggestions, but I think a lot of them actually won't get us to saving money now, which is what I want to focus on. How do we save money now? And I also respect everything that Roz said, because I think he's correct. We've had a perspective as build it and they will use it, kind of build it and they will come attitude. I've only been on this VTA board for 5 years, so I don't have the depth and perspective. We always want, as a council member, we always want more services for our constituents, right? There's a new extension of light rail going to Eastridge that is millions above budget, and I don't know how much it's going to cost us to run it. But it's a very difficult political hurdle to say no to your constituents now. So I understand, and there would happen to be Cindy's constituents. So, so I understand your perspective, and I think that you're right. But also, I've been to a lot of cities, and if you don't have a network infrastructure large enough, then people won't actually use it. So my real hope is that people will actually start using and paying the fares, which is the only way, really, I think that we can dig our way out of this problem, is if people start taking public transit. Now, with the fact that we're actually very serious about building houses, in San Jose anyway, we're very serious about building houses next to light rail, next to public transit. And again, I have approved 2 in my district, and one's already approved at Tamian. Still, I think that we're actually going in the right direction, but it's not coming soon enough. And I think we need to consider short term. Now, I know that our short-term problems. Now, I know that our employees are often asked to sacrifice. They're one of the first people to be asked to sacrifice, and I think it's important to recognize that. But also, in the good times, we have never been stingy with raises when we actually have money. And I've voted for every single raise in 5 years that I've been on VTA. So we've actually never had a budget cut in the last 5 years, and we voted for increases every year for the last 5 years since I've been on VTA. So I would say that in the good times, I think VTA treats its employees extremely well. In the bad times, it's just going to hurt, and I know it's just a fact of this cycle that we're in. But in the long run, we need to concentrate on fare box recovery. No other transit agency has the low numbers we do.
Right. Sorry. Oh, right. Sorry. I just have a couple more. Right. I know the downtown Palo Alto Transportation Management Agency is currently, it has some kind of pilot project where it's buying transit fares for its low-income workers to reduce congestion in downtown Palo Alto. Is there any way to get just the number of those passes that are actually going to VTA? It's a smaller question.
Okay.
And then secondly, in San Jose, there was just a long conversation around the cost of development, and one of the things that came up was that the cost of parking was becoming a sort of an anchor around being able to build housing, and that we're just trying to think about ways that VTA could look at partnering with some of these developers in some of these cities to try to see, to look for creative ways to address the transportation needs of the residents who are going into these new developments, and whether or not it could become a kind of development standard to be part of the EcoPass program, so that we can sort of expand the residential aspect of the EcoPass holders. Putting that on the agenda. And then thirdly, and I understand that folks are already thinking about this and working on this, but I was wondering whether or not there was a version of the EcoPass that could be less company-based. I understand that there's a whole team that's going out and talking to companies individually, but I was wondering if there could be like a more geographic or maybe a corporate park type situation in which you can spread out the cost of the EcoPass for the entire sort of geographic area, right? Whether that's a, you know, it's an employment center or for a downtown, that sort of thing, so that it could spread out the cost and make it maybe easier for someone to sign up for the EcoPass if it feels like the cost is more shared, right? It feels more like insurance than it feels like an individual policy. And then to the councilperson's point, I do want to talk about, are we thinking about, because of the delay, it's given us a little bit more time, are we thinking about Next Network again? Or are we still just planning on implementing Next Network as it stood? That was supposed to come in, like you said, in September 2017. Now we're not sure, you know, it could be January, it could be whenever. It's giving us a little bit of time to plan. Is there any way that we can start rethinking about whether or not we're being actually bold enough as far as the land use aspect of Next Network? And what I mean is, it's come up a couple of times here about the signal prioritization, about the bus lane dedication, about all-door boarding, about off-board payment strategies, other ways to sort of speed up service and make it more attractive. And I understand there's some issues around, you know, the fact that you have to deal with each one of the cities and those are changes that they have to make. But are we thinking about figuring out ways for Next Network to be sort of the vehicle for those kinds of changes?
If I may just, because that's a very important question you've asked, and I believe it was at last meeting we talked a little bit about the business model, or do we have the right business model? But coming back to those examples that you shared, they're really not tied to Next Network, that's just efficiency. And many of those things require us to work with cities, and we're doing that. For those things that are within our control, we're evaluating options. As most of you around the table may know, I'm part of the whole NPC Executive Committee on Clipper, for the next generation of Clipper. So when we talk about buying tickets and speeding up how we move through the system, that next generation may just boil down to something that you're already carrying with you. So therefore, but the things that are physical infrastructure, where we were working with cities, we're on that. We're all over that because we recognize that what the customers value is their time. And if we don't give them something that's going to keep them within the time frame that they have allotted from their home to wherever they're going, they're going to choose other options. So that's our focus right now. That's what I've asked the team to do, is focus on how we can improve the time it takes an individual to get from point A to point B.
Definitely really appreciate that. I guess my question or the suggestion was, is there any way to sort of package this in some way?
It's the FAST program.
Yeah,
Is that the FAST program?
Yes.
yes, the FAST plan that's gonna be implemented in the program.
Okay, Gabe?
Just to expand a little bit more on my comments about what we should be looking at in terms of the measures. And Supervisor Chubb is correct. I mean, you know, the ridership and the fare box recovery is very low in South County, right? And under the next network, we already lost service. There's a reduction of service in our community because of that. I recently learned that VTA is going to be studying the express routes and possibly reducing that further because the fare box recovery and the ridership is not there. My point being is, we talk about social justice and that moral obligation. That's one side of it, but then there's the business side of it. And it's hard for me to argue as a city administrator for my community that we need service when the ridership and the fare box is not there and when VTA as a business is losing money. So I think my comment to that would be that as we look for solutions, that we do it across the board. It's not just looking at impacting one area, but if it means everybody has to take some pain with it, then I think that's what it comes down to. Yes, on the one hand, I'd love for my residents to be able to still have that service, but again, when the data's not there, it's hard to tell people go ride the bus to increase the numbers to justify why we should have bus routes, right? So I just ask that we continue to look at this, but look at all things at the table so that no one segment of our service areas is the only areas that impacted us. For example, reduction of service zone.
Okay, so if it's okay with everybody,
One quick question. I heard Doria say earlier that VTA is working on making the system more efficient, faster. When is that report going to come out, or the studies that are being done?
If I may, there are studies, there are negotiations with the different cities that are associated with it. Unitas and his team are working on a program that looks at a lot of the other areas, but for the most part, we're engaged in conversations with all of the cities in order to try to implement the city prioritization system. And when we are successful, we'll hear all about it.
But do you guys really think that signal prioritization will lead to efficiencies that will get people on our trains?
I think, I'm gonna jump. I think that, the theory here is, we've just got such a diverse community. We've got the really well-to-do, and then we go the other way, right? I think when we look at public transportation and such, one of the key things that I think we all recognize, and I think this is what FAST is trying to do, this is what we also tried to do with the BRT, but because of land use decisions, we kind of failed miserably, so now we've got this FAST program that we're focusing on some very targeted areas, is that to get people out of their cars, okay, we have, the service has to compete with the cars. At this point in time, too much of our service is slower than going in the automobile, okay? And so how do we start shifting that? And I think this is where the FAST program is going to do that. When we talked about BRT, it's the land use decision makers. It's like to do that in an existing corridor requires taking away something from the automobile, right? It means dedicating a lane. And we can't get over that hurdle yet with the cities along the corridors and such. So what we're doing right now, I think they're wonderful programs. I don't want to disparage the programs that we're doing, but what we're going to be getting out of that are just increments, and somehow we've got to get to where you can get on transit. Again, if you look at a Caltrain, you can get on that. It's a very predictable ride, right? Because it's just what's happening on that rail line. It's when you look at our buses and you look at our light rail, we're in that same space as the automobile and the pedestrian, et cetera, and so we don't have that. So anyway, so that's what we're trying to do. It's not a silver bullet. It's not something that's going to solve our deficit, our structural problem. Okay, it's just something to how to get the ridership up through some system efficiencies.
I think I'm going to go back to what I said, perhaps not this time, but the last time, that VTA needs to think of making their system faster and efficient than making it any bigger than what it is currently. Because it's not gonna help whether we get an East Ridge extension or whether we get an extension into Los Altos. None of them matters until the downtown is fixed, so that we have fast movement from north to south and east to west.
Yes, and I'm not gonna disagree with anything that you have said, okay? I think human nature, everybody wants a shiny new toy and not thinking about the ones that we already have. So, you know, again, I think you're right, I don't disagree with you. So what I'm gonna try and do now is, you know, I told you, I asked everyone to block off their time until 4 o'clock. We've all done that. I think we're all kind of starting to drag now. I know I'm feeling that way. So I'm gonna try moving us forward so we can get to the end of this meeting. Item number 11, so before I get into item 11, this conversation that we've just had here is very, very productive. We're saying things that need to be said out there, and I really do appreciate everybody putting themselves out there and their positions out there, whether it's their own individual or whether it's the groups that they're representing. So with that said, item number 11 is committee work plan. So we're not walking through a committee work plan, okay? So what we're gonna do here is, I just wanna say that this is our third meeting. We have a long way to go, okay? Because we're still wrestling with the issues and we haven't moved to solutions yet. I appreciate all the information and all the discussions that we've had. I think what we need to do next is we're gonna figure out how we're gonna make productive use of our next meeting, okay? And again, I do not anticipate, maybe you guys can all prove me wrong, that we're going to miraculously come up with all the solutions in our next meeting, okay? It would have to be longer than a 4-hour meeting. So what I wanna do is ask for a little bit of latitude here and say, first, we're going to start scheduling, we're gonna schedule some more meetings beyond June, correct? Okay? So if we could put, if Elaine is gonna be working with all of us to get more of these meetings booked, okay? Don't know how far out. Not to say that we're gonna use every one of them, but I think it's important for us to lock them into the calendar like we did with this first set of meetings, okay? So I'm gonna ask for everybody's cooperation in terms of responding to the board secretary's office on the doodle, okay? Next is this next meeting, in terms of we have kind of another shopping list here for staff. I want to work with staff to try and figure out how to get that information to us. Up to this point, all the information comes through presentations. I want to minimize the presentations at our next meeting, if not eliminate them, so that we can start doing the working. So I'm going to ask for some latitude so I can work with staff to figure out how to get this information to us, and so that we can slim down the presentation part next meeting. And then I'm also going to ask that the committee, you know, we've got the stakeholder groups all here, and again, the conversation's been wonderful. I'm going to ask staff to also help me work with my 2 colleagues here, because we are the committees in the decision-making, to try and make sure I have a really good understanding of what we're going to need to get to that point as well, and then start shaping, working with the consultants and staff, and with inputs that staff will get from my 2 colleagues, to try and figure out how we're going to shape the next meeting. So the next meeting might be a little bit of a surprise, because I don't have the answer right now, but it is to get us moving, okay? Is that comfortable with everybody? Okay. So with that, are there any questions, comments, or announcements?
One comment.
Yes.
One comment. Is there a way to get sort of the agenda a little bit earlier for prep time?
So that's part of why I said if I have a little bit of latitude in terms of, I think it's the information in the packet that you're actually asking for. So yes, we'll try and see, that's what I want to say. I want to see what we can do in terms of trying to get the relevant information earlier into our hands, okay? Any other comments, questions, announcements?
well, no, it's not an announcement, I just needed some guidance. And I stepped out of the room for a few minutes, so I'm not sure if you covered this. But my understanding is when this ad hoc committee was formed, that we will be getting some recommendations before the fiscal year 2019 was in effect, which happens on July 1st. So with the additional information that's been requested and the suggestion of workshops, I'm just wondering what type of guidance we're gonna get as we going into fiscal year 19, if any at all, or if we're gonna have to wait till there's a final set of recommendations that may come about towards the end of the year. I could not read where the group was going in that regard.
Well, I don't think the group is at a point where we have specific recommendations that can be taken to the board and put into, I think.
No, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I was not asking for recommendations specifically, but guidance. We're going into fiscal year 19, so what I'm hearing is, because there's additional work that needs to happen, we have to stay the course. Is that what, thank you.
I think that's basically, we have to stay the course. Okay. Any announcements, questions, anything from anybody else? If not, I'm going to say thank you very much. And the meeting is adjourned.